So let's start this morning with the software tools. And the first one will be the EFSA Platform on BMD analysis, which will be presented by José Cortiñas, which is a scientific officer at EFSA. He is a mathematician and a biostatistician, so he will be certainly needed within EFSA for the standing working group as announced by Bernard, and will help the panels when encountering problems. So, José, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joseph. I know that now you have a very big expectation about this tool, and I will try to fulfill that expectation. We try to make it as simple as possible. Let us see if it works. It's always risky, but we are all risk assessors, because it's going to be okay. I hope so. Well, it's just basically a website. As you go to whatever of your web browser that you have, you just type efsa.openanalytics.eu, and that take you to a login page. Now until now the idea is that you ask or you request access to our tools, and then we just create a profile for you and we grant you access. It's not, you don't need, it is freely available to everyone. We just did it this way in order to be able to know who are the ones that are basically connecting to our website, and to monitor a little bit the activities within our platforms. But it's basically free, and everybody can ask access. Now we have around 70 users already, and basically these things we have started just a year ago, trying to put some tools in there. We have gradually been receiving a lot of requests to get access to the tool. And now we have seen that this is becoming a bit unmanageable from our side, because then we need to create a profile, and we are trying to work on a system like you use to create a Gmail account or things like that, in which you basically register yourself and then just create your own profile, and then you are able to use it. Thus we are working on that right now, but it's not yet available. But now I am just going to log in myself. But if you want to try whatever, because there are several tools within this platform, if you want to try, there is an account that is called guest, and then the password is also guest. That's very simple to enter there. And then you have already 3 tools that are available within this platform that you will be able to explore. Okay? But I am just entering. Let us see if it works. Not much to work. You see, there are already 6 tools that are available within this platform. We are trying to get this a bit more sexy, fancy to the people, just more attractive to help them to use the platform as well. But the one that we will be talking today is BMD dose, is benchmark dose. But there are other things that we are just put there for people to use, for the scientific community to use, and for their own purposes. The tool is based on the PROAS software. Thus we have used many of the PROAS functions in order to be able to create this tool. We are still working on it. Thus we have a project of 1.5 years to be able to improve this tool, to incorporate other models, to use it also to expand the family of models that we have for continuous data, to also include as well model averaging in continuous data. At this time, the only thing that it does is basically quantal and continuous data, and model averaging only for quantal data. Okay, the continuous model averaging is not yet implemented in the tool, but we are still working on this. Okay, now, yesterday you have heard that there are many different ways of dealing with this type of problems. You have what in general was done before by BMDS and PROAS. Is just basically what a statistician call frequentis approach. Okay, it's just basically you just consider that your parameters are just unknown constants, and you try to estimate them. You know, if you move from that paradigm to another one, which is the one that Matthew is working on, and with the EPA, is just a Bayesian framework. The parameters there are not constant unknowns, but they are just basically just random variables. And this is just different way of looking at the things, but it's just still analyzing the same type of models and using the same type of models to basically create a dose response model. Okay. Now the tool, as you see, is very simple. It just contains two tabs, one with data in which you need to load the data, another one with feed the models, and then there you need to just provide some information to know what are you going to do, no, with that data. Just you can browse there, here the data. Well, I'm going to show some of the things. There is an about button there that if you click on it, you are redirected to like a kind of a wiki page. And in that wiki page, there is also the manual and all the things that you can see to be able to use the tool. But the tool is quite intuitive. Yeah? And if you have any problem, when you are using the tool, you can report an issue. Thus, immediately we are able then to tackle that particular issue whenever you have observed any issue there. Okay? Thus, here you have a browse button in which you can just go there and browse your PC and go and basically upload the data that you want to use. Okay? There are several formats that the tool support. You can have tab-separated file, space-separated file, comma-separated file, semicolon, because there are several ways in which you can just construct your database. Yeah, and then you have, because in this world we have decimal points or decimal comma separators, we have also that as well in order to be able to accommodate different people's PC's configuration. But in fact, the software as such just try to recognize what is the things that you are passing it. Thus, if you don't need to select any of the file formats, he will recognize it if you just open it. If it's not one of these, then he will not recognize it. Because of course, I mean, we have a limited set of options that we can just introduce there. But then you could just convert it to one of these formats, and then you will be able to use it. Then you can subset your data. You can just define which one is the response that you are uploading and the type of response that it is, and things like that. Now I am just going to browse. I have just here an example. I will start with Quantal. Okay, you have seen some of these already. You know, in some of the presentation, you have this part. And if you look at the guidance, this is one of the data sets that was there analyzed as well. Okay, I just make a toy example. I just create a male as well. I didn't want only females there, you know. I want also to get some male results there to be able to use the covariate approach and then to show you also as well. Thus, as you see, I just, this is a tab separated file, and I just browse it. I went there, I open it, and the file already display in the application. Thus, it's very nice. You can now subset your data. For instance, if you want to do a subgroup analysis and you want to just consider the females, you can just go here, scroll it. You can just use covariates, and you say, I want to keep only the female. Yeah, and then you see that immediately the data set has been updated, and you have only the females in this. That is very intuitive, very simple. Not much thing to do. I am not going to subset it because I want you just to show you how the tool works with covariates. You can introduce covariates in the tool. Now, here you need to reply to this question, which one is the response? Because, I mean, he uploaded the table, but he doesn't know. You can give the name that you want. He doesn't know what is the response variable. Thus, you need to basically tell the tool what is the response variable. In this case, it's effect. Okay, I just call it effect. And then you need to define which one is the type of response. These things, we are expecting you to know what is the type of response. Thus, in this case, it's a quantal. I already told you there is a quantal. And you could also tick on the fact that you might have also liter effect in your data. Thus, you can just also consider the fact that there is a litter effect in your data. You could just tick on that one. In this case, I don't have a litter effect. That's why I'm not going to tick on it. But then the tool is going to build a model that considers the fact that you have litter in your data. Now, once you have uploaded all the information, you have replied to this question, then you can pass to the fitting of the models. Yeah. So you go to the fitting tab, and there already he pre-filled some of the things. If you follow the order that I was having in this particular table, everything is pre-filled for you and it's okay. Yeah. But even if it's not okay, you can just change it anyway. Okay. Now. In this application, because yesterday you said you might have many endpoints that you would like to analyze once. In the PROAS, you are able to do that here as well. Okay? Because if I would have another endpoint there, I could just click, and then the two endpoints are going to be just analyzed one after the other ones. Okay? But, okay, here I have only one endpoint, sorry. Thus, now the things has already been pre-filled. You know what is the independent variable? It's those is there. What is the response? You define it before. Thus, he already knows that what is the response that you're going to analyze. And then what is the variable that contains the sample size? Thus, he already pre-filled if you have this particular order that we were having before. Yeah. In any case, you can always change here things depending on how you were defining your table. Okay, now we are using a parametric bootstrap. This is, if we are doing model averaging, we are just bootstrapping the data. Yesterday, Alan was just was explaining you how these things is done. It's based on the paper of Matthew. And then basically you need to define as well then how many bootstraps do you want to use. The default value is 200. I am not going to run 200 just because I want this to be as fast as possible. And but it's just a demonstration. Thus, you can just define also which one is the benchmark criteria that you want to use. In general, we recommend in the guidance extra risk. That's why it's the default option here. But you have other options that you could use if you want. Okay? These are the same options that you can get in the Pro software as well. Then you can define which one is the value of BMR. This something that is outside the tool. You need to be able to know what is the BMR that you should use. Okay? And luckily, you have a biological explanation to choose this particular BMR. In another case, you will need to deal with it in different ways, and that we are not going to touch upon here. Isn't it, Joseph? Then you construct here a confidence interval. Thus, you need to define what is the confidence interval that you are going to construct. And in fact, it's a 90% confidence interval because we are defining 5% below and 5% above. Thus, it's a 90%. That's why it's there 0.9. Okay? Now, you can still add certain things to your model. Thus, there are other model parameters. You can include covariates, for instance, and then you can just put here a covariate or not. I am not going to put it just yet. Okay, and you have some advanced settings if you want some other parameters in your model to depend on the covariate as well. Okay, but I'm not going to do that. The default options are basically parameter A and B that was shown yesterday are the ones that are depending on the covariate. Okay, now here you have also a tick mark in which you can perform model averaging or not. In the case of Quantal, you have this option. In the case of Continue, this option does not appear because it's not implemented. Thus, it doesn't make sense to put this option there yet. Thus, I'm just going to show you without performing model averaging and no covariates. Okay, you get basically very fast a table with the models, the value of the log likelihood, the AIC, the BMDs, the BMDLs, and the BMDUs for all models. Okay, you can download each of the tables separately. It gives you which one is the lowest BMDL and the highest BMDU. Okay, and it gives you just the the model that was better fitting your data according to the AIC criteria. Okay? Of course, we don't want that. We want you to use model averaging. Okay? Then here still we have not considered the fact that we have covariates in our model. Thus, we can just include the covariate effect and fit the model again without model averaging. Does this take a bit more time? It's still a web application. Does it need to connect to a server, send the query to run the models? Does it's a bit more time consuming, but still you get everything. You get also here, you see that for each of the different family of models, because now you have logistic, with parameter A depending on the covariate, parameter B depending on the covariate, parameter A and B depending on the covariate. Thus he's fitting all these different models, and then from each of the different families he just takes the best model, in which parameter depends on the covariate or not. And then you get also a BMD and a BMDL and the BMDU for each of the classes in your covariate. In this case was female and male, then you get it for female, there is the values, and then you get also for the males. Yeah? And as well give you which one is the best model that is fitting the data when you consider the covariate. Okay? Now, but we want to use the model averaging approach. Okay? Thus we can tick that one and we can try to fit the model. This is going to take a bit more time. Sorry. Now we can talk. But, well, I mean, the idea is not that you get a fast answer. The idea is that you get an answer and that you are able to use a tool that is very simple to use and is very user-friendly. Okay? We are working on getting a fast answer, don't worry. The issue is still you depend on the internet connection. Still, it's a web application. Thus, it's hosted in a particular server. You need to send queries to that server. This server is basically just running whatever you are asking them to do, and then sending back the answers. Okay, it's finished. I fill in the time. It's okay. Now you see that basically you get then the model averaging just performed for this, considering covariates in this case. In the software that we had from Matthew, it didn't contain covariate at that time. I hope that now he is having also software that contains covariate. Now we try to include covariate. You can see now there each of the different bootstrap runs. No, Matthew? Was not like this?
I don't know. I haven't done covariates. No. I mean, I could easily do it, but...
Yeah, no, I can imagine. I am not saying that this is not easy to do. I mean, we are doing it. That should be easy. You can see there that now you have each of the bootstrap runs that you basically ask the software to do. You have a line there. These are the red and the green lines. And you have a darker red and a darker green line that is the one that is basically getting from the data that you were passing. Okay? And then you are able then to get the BMDs and BMDLs and BMDU for each of the covariates based on the model average. Yeah? Okay? Now, this is not all. We had in our guidance, we had in the annex a template that you should use. And now the things that we did was, okay, based on the selections that you made when you were trying to analyze your data, we are able to construct a report for you. You can just click on each of the different tables and download that table and put it in a report. But we try to make it easier for you, and then we create a button here in which it creates already the report with each of the different sessions that we say that you should use in your reporting BMD analysis. Okay? And then you click on that one, and it is download the report. You can open it. Yes. And then it basically provides you a report in which you have the data, which one is the endpoint that you have analyzed, how the data looks like, what is the BMR that you have used. It gives you some indication of things that you should basically provide. You see, it's in a different font there. italic in this case, just that you give a bit of a rationale of the endpoint that you have used. It provides you also information about the software package that was used, which is based on a PROAS at the time, and the model averaging also. It gives you information already on the things that were already used to fit your model. Some specification, what were the general assumptions that you have used. Thus is given already there, it's pre-filled for you. It gives you some information about the models that you were using, yeah, and what is the parameterization that you were using. What is the procedure to select the BMDL in this case? What was the flowchart that you used? That was something that was coming also from the guidance document. And it gives you information about the results with the tables of all models. This one is a bit large because, and then which one is the table of the BMDs, BMDLs, and BMDUs for each of the covariate classes that we were analyzing in this case. And then just have a conclusion session in which you need to basically just fill in yourself. We could not do that for you. It's a bit difficult. Okay? But at least you have already a format in which you can just already start working on it, and you can already do things there. And it would be, harmonized template that everybody that is using this tool have exactly the same type of reports, considering the assumptions that were made, the selections that were done when they were analyzing the data and things like that. Okay, the tool allows you also to do other things. There is also an advanced setting here. For instance, yesterday they were talking about, this is using average dose response, yeah? But you could also use the average BMD. Does it give you also the possibility to include that as well, just for comparison purpose if you want to use it, that you can include that things there. You can tick on that one and you can rerun everything, and then you get then the values of the BMD, BMDLs, and BMDUs, considering average response or average BMDs. Just for information, just to see how much they differ. You could also select different models. You could exclude models if you want. You can say, okay, I don't want to have the two-stage in the model averaging. You can exclude that. This is going to appear in your report, and then you will need to explain why you exclude that. Okay? Because the default option is that you use as many models as possible because you are trying to account for model uncertainty. Okay? Now, exactly the same process could be followed for a continuous variable. I don't know. Do you want to see it? Yes? I mean, nothing is changing. It's just exactly the same procedure. Now you have a data in which is basic. Now, I just changed the format just to show you that you don't need to basically specify what is the format before you are loading your data. For instance, this was a comma-separated variable file. And I just browsed it, I went there, I click on it, and the file is already, the file format is recognized, and the table is already displayed for you. This is also something you have seen as well, because this is based on one of the examples that were in the guidance document. You can subset it here as well. You can define which one is your response. In this case, I have my response, I call it response. And you can define which one is the type of response you have. In the case of continuous, you can have individual data or summary data. There you need to specify what is the type of data you are using. In this case, we are just having mean and standard deviation. This is a summary data. You can also define as well, in this case, if you have litter effect or not, that you could also click on that particular option. And already tell you that model averaging is only available for quantile data responses, no? Quantile response data. Thus, already you know in advance you are not going to be able to perform the model averaging in this case, okay? But we are working on it. Now, then you go to the same process here. You have fitting models. You have the next tab. Here, he already pre-filled some things for you. For instance, the dose is already pre-filled. The variation statistics is already pre-filled. You need to say if it is a standard deviation or standard error. This is common in everything. And now, for instance, the sample size is not, I didn't put it in the right column, just to show you that, it pre-fills things, but you need to still do something, yeah? Okay, now in this case it's not covariant, my sample size is n. So I just change it and then I can just go and feed my model. I could, I have exactly the same settings here. Now in this case, I only have here the values that are the default in our guidance, which is 5%, 0.05. You can define different confidence level and model parameters. I am going to use here the covariates already. You can put more than one covariate. He will just create a new covariate, which is basically the interaction between these two covariates. And then you can feed the models. You can feed also set of models or a single model if you want. I mean, the recommended option is that you feed set of models, a suite of models. That's why it's basically a default option. And then you can just feed the models there. It's exactly the same process. It's just the option changes because you're having a different type of data. But it's very simple to use. It creates a report for you. And then you can already start just working with the report that it provided. Yeah, you need to basically justify several of the options that you have made, but it still already give you a template in which you can already start working on. Okay, here it is already results. You can get the results of the different models. In the case of continuous, we recommend only Hill and exponential model with 3 or 4 parameters. Yeah, which strangely enough we call it 3 and 5. Well, it's just historical. And then it gives you already there what is the lowest BMDL and the highest BMDU for each of the different covariates, female and males. And it gives you which one is the best model fitted for your data. Okay, I mean, that's all. If you have any question.
Thanks, Jose. Yes, questions? You might have noticed that Jose changed for model averaging from 200 bootstrap runs to 20. If you change that to 2000, you are sitting in front of your computer for quite a while. You have seen how long it took for 20. If you go to 200, it does it 10 times more, meaning it needs more time. So don't be surprised if you can go and drink a coffee while you see the circling. So this is for at least beginners maybe a shock that when I used it first time I thought I did make something wrong because the computer seems to be blocked and it kept circling for half an hour. If you play too much with these figures, you still need to know what you are doing. So start off with a low number of bootstrap runs, or as Jose has shown, start just without model averaging to get an idea about the models, what the output is, and then go to model averaging.
Yeah. But
any questions?
In general, I mean, we are trying to reduce the amount of time that this is taking, but still it's a web application. It's not an application that is hosted in your PC. That would use your resources. In this case, just basically connecting through the network to a server and then just getting things back from there. Also, we are using, I mean, this is all fully based on R. Yeah. If we would just program this in a different programming language like C++ or Python or something like that, it will be much faster because the routines there for optimizations are better than the ones that are actually provided by R. But still, we wanted to have something that was fully R produced. Yeah, that's why. And I don't know that if it's really that problematic to wait. You just go and take a coffee and you get the results back. You basically press on the download report and then you get already something there.
I didn't say it's problematic. It's you need to know because otherwise you think something has happened and then you kill the program and restart again and then it takes time again. So just be aware of that. And it has really a huge advantage also for people using official computers in agencies, because here you don't need any administrative rights on the computer, because that's working, as Jose is saying, as a web tool. And formerly, with certain programs, some people had difficulties to download and install it. If you need to install a program on your computer, that may pose some problems for certain security reasons. Questions from the floor? Barbara?
I have a question. I have a question about the numbers of bootstrapping. Does it make a big influence on the result? So as I understood now, to play around, it's good to use a few bootstraps to run it faster, but for the final result, is there a default value of bootstraps that should be taken?
Well, I mean, the more you run, the better. Okay, this is always a good principle. You know, we have put 200 as a default because we have seen that 200 is already giving you enough indications to construct a good confidence interval. But the more you run, the better.
Okay, thank you.
For the final run, you can drink
Matt, you
2
want
or
to say
3
something
coffees.
I was going to say, generally in the literature, it's about 1,000
Yeah.
to guarantee, and then 2,000 was what I originally did just to make sure, but about 1,000 given the web tool as a final, but have some coffee, I guess.
I have a question. If you have multiple effects, will it do? Yeah, it's back. When you have multiple calculations, will it do the whole analysis in one report, or do you have to do one by one?
No.
Multiple effects.
No, it will basically run all the analysis one after each other. You will have in the screen also all the analysis results as well. And you could create a report in which all the analyses are going to be reported in one report.
And what if you want to use it for a paper? Do you refer to the software? Does it say somewhere how to use a cross-reference? If you want to write a reviewed paper, and you add this, for instance, as supplementary material or something, is that possible? Are there rights on it, or how does it work?
No, I mean, the idea is just, as long as you acknowledge the fact that you have used the application, for us it's fine. I mean, this is within a bigger project that we call it Open Sky in EFSA. The idea is just to make as much as possible things available to the scientific community that they are able to use. We have a repository that is called Zenodo, in which these are just part of this repository, in which we have models there and all documentation about models that we have used in EFSA. Okay, we are increasingly updating this repository, trying to put more things there, and we basically just ask everyone that has any model to basically include in that repository, because then they can benefit also from feedbacks and things like that. And there we have a DOI for each of these different tools. Thus, there is also a way of citing these particular tools as well. Thus, they have a DOI, a digital object identifier, and you will be able to use that in your citation. Okay? But the idea is just to acknowledge the fact that you are using the tool.
Is it mentioned in the report, the final report, or not? The reference?
No.
No. Maybe an idea.
Yeah. No.
There is a question over there, and then on the back.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Just practical things. So when we go back home, we will send you an email to get access to that site. And is there a user manual? Like it's good when somebody that knows the software presents and everything seems very reasonable and easy. But when you get down to it, you don't know what to enter and which option to select. Will there be a guide of how to actually use that tool? Thank you.
Yeah, there is. I already said that here there is an about button. Of course, maybe you need to know where to enter and things like that. I hope that you take note. It's efsa.openanalytics.eu. But we are going to provide, I think, also information about the manual, because the manual is there. It's a PDF file. Let me see if I can find it. Somewhere here in the desktop. Slide. BMD. And I hope that we will provide this to everyone. Because there is a manual there in which guides you through what are the things that you need to use. Okay? It gives every single screen and what they mean. There's all this explanation is basically there. Provide you information about the flow chart that has been used, how you can. It has a different screenshot with the things that we were doing right now, just guiding you through the steps that you need to take in order to be able to do a BMD analysis. But as such, when you basically face the tool, it's very intuitive. I didn't give the manual to Alan.
I figured it out all on my own.
You see?
Me too.
Do it.
But still, the manual we are going to provide it, I am assuming, isn't it, Bernard?
Yeah, there is no problem, just as we will upload all the presentations of this workshop, we can also upload the manual on the workshop webpage, there is no problem.
Okay.
Yeah, I have a quite practical question. Let's imagine that we have a study, a real study with n effects, let's say 20. We put our data, we make the analysis so nicely that we can do with one if we have the data entry, and then we take a list of results. And we have for each endpoint a benchmark dose. Logically, I'm imagining that we have to choose as the one for the study the lowest among the different effects.
Oh, well, this doesn't necessarily need to be true. I mean, whenever we are doing any analysis, it's not merely just to do an analysis. It's just because we want to do something. There is also some biologically, discussions that need to be done before you start to do any analysis. Okay?
Yeah, but I will end to the statistical issue I have in mind.
Yeah.
We can imagine a simple example of 3 endpoints that we saw in the initial discussion that these are most probably the critical for us. And then we will take 3 values. Among the 3 values, one may think that, okay, the lowest will set the overall benchmark dose low bound for the whole study. Though, in this issue is coming also the ratio between the upper and the lower. Means the worst data, they will give me the lowest value. And then if we go to choose among the 3 endpoints the lowest value without considering having a specific rule in practice in mind that, okay, this came just because the data are really crappy, then we are really out of reality. So I would like your comment how, if you have some idea practically.
Well, as such, the tool will provide you the analysis for the 3 endpoints with the confidence interval for the 3 endpoints, and you will be able then to reason about the analysis results. It's not that you just go there and blindly take the lowest bound result. That is something, I mean, as a statistician, we cannot tell you which one is the endpoint to use or things like that. We can give you guidance about if you have a very large confidence interval, that already has been said that maybe you should reconsider the data for that particular endpoint because maybe there is not enough information in your data in order to be able to use that. This has already been said before. These kind of considerations are basically just always use. It's not that you can just take the analysis, go to the lower bound, use that blindly without just basically considering anything else. You need to basically look at the results and try to reason what the results are giving you. But we don't have a rule of thumb to say this is the thing that you should use.
About?
So as Joseph said, the statistical analysis gives you an overview of all the uncertainties in the BMD for each endpoint. And the idea is later on, I don't think it's in the application now yet, but to give you a plot with all the confidence intervals together. And then you more or less have a nice overview, and as an example, it might not always be the lowest BMDL that you would choose, and as an example, you can think of maybe, let's say we have 7 different blood parameters measured, and 6 of those have pretty much the same BMDL, but one of them is has a much lower BMDL because it has a very wide confidence interval. Maybe it was not neutrophils or something, because the number of counts is very low relatively, and therefore you have more uncertainty. So in this case, you would say, well, all those blood parameters behave very similar. Only the neutrophils is much more uncertain, and in this case, I think that this low BMDL is just due to uncertainty. And we have good reason here in this case to ignore that very low BMDL and just take one of the others, because they are all very similar. So this type of argumentations, just as an example, can be made when you have an overview of the whole toxicological profile, so to say. Okay?
But is the system also give the ratio automatically between the low and the upper?
Well, you get this visual plot, so you directly see, oh, this is really a large confidence interval. It is plotted on the log dose scale, so you directly see, well, this is more than 1 or maybe 2 or 3 orders of magnitude. You can just read it from the x-axis.
But this in any case may reflect the normal variation, because as parameter may have a higher normal variation. So I totally agree with you that we have to consider all these issues before just applying mathematics, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I would say we just do the statistical analysis. This tells you what are the data able to tell us. In some cases, the data have a lot of information. You get small confidence intervals for the BMD. In other cases, the data are not very informative, and you get wide intervals. So that is really uncertainty, and then it is a matter. I think you need to get some experience, because it's a little bit different way of thinking, as you are used to. Because there you just say I see an effect or I don't see an effect, and that's very simple and very clear. But when you think about uncertainty, then you need to. Well, it's another way of thinking, and I think after some practice you will get used to that.
Okay, I think we need to move on now. One more.
Yeah, I had just a practical. Practical question. Does the server store any of the data that the users it deletes it after every run? Perfect.
Yeah. The software, I mean, all the data is locally because you were browsing your local hard drive. Yeah? Okay, the data is locally. He just basically just upload it in the server, and once he finished this, and then you just log out, sign out of that system, everything that was there in that session is basically just put it in the trash and gone. Okay?
Okay, let's move on. We will hear as a next for the EPA software and the guidance there. Alan, please.
Do I need to have it up? Okay, excellent. All right, so a lot of the issues that I'm going to discuss today regarding EPA's guidance have already organically come up for discussion yesterday. So hopefully there won't be a lot of surprises. and I'll try to highlight areas where the EPA and EFSA agree on guidance, and highlight issues where there's still a little bit, where there's room left for more harmonization. I won't say disagree. I'll paint it in a positive light. Again, the disclaimer, everything I say is my own opinion and does not necessarily reflect the policies of the EPA, which is odd because I'll be talking about our official BMD guidance. But lawyers are a particular bunch. So in 2012, EPA finalized our BMD technical guidance after an extended external review process. And I would say the majority of our there's an important distinction to be made between guidance and modeling practice. Guidance reflects a very robust external peer review process, but it's static. In 2012, we published the guidance. There are other guidance documents available on the Integrated Risk Information System website as it pertains to BMD modeling for particular types of endpoints: developmental toxicity, reproductive toxicity, neurological toxicity. And this is official guidance, but the state of the science moves faster than our review process. And so our statistical working group periodically updates what I guess can be considered recommended modeling practices. And typically we will either publish papers on these updated processes, or you'll see them applied in our chemical assessments. We don't nearly move as fast as EFSA. I was very impressed with the 1.5-year process it took to update guidance. It was like light speed to somebody from the EPA. This does not appear to be working. Is there another pointer that might work? Aha. Okay. So I'm going to try to go through our guidance very, very quickly. This is typically a day-long course that my colleague and I give, so to try to give it in 30 minutes is a daunting task. But on the screen is our BMD analysis workflow, and it consists basically of 6 steps. You need to choose the BMR and the dose metrics you're going to use. You need to select the appropriate set of models that you're going to apply to your data. You need to determine whether or not any of your models statistically fit the data. Steps 4 and 5 are maybe crude is too negative of a word, but awesome, thank you. Steps 4 and 5, you're trying to answer whether or not there's a high degree of model uncertainty in your data or model dependence in your results. And that will lead you to 2 different selection criteria: whether or not you select the model that's giving you the lowest BMDL, or whether or not you use the AIC as your selection criteria to pick your final model. I guess this is a good point to say EPA guidance is still centered entirely on selecting a single best representative model and does not yet reflect the application of model averaging. And then step 6 is just documenting your BMD analysis. The goal there being you want to give an end reader enough information to recreate your analysis should they want to. So regarding BMR selection, I guess this is, you start off on a positive note, and this is where EFSA and EPA agree regarding the use of extra risk for a BMR for dichotomous data and a value of 10%. 10% was customarily used because it was near the limit of detection for cancer bioassays or non-cancer bioassays of a similar size. From a practical standpoint, we use subchronic data a lot in our analyses, and moving away from a 10% BMR is going to put you below the observed range of data in a lot of cases. However, if you are using studies that have a greater degree of sensitivity due to nested study design, such as a developmental tox study, the guidance does acknowledge that you can and recommends that you use a 5% BMR. We discussed yesterday rationales for moving away from 10% for more frank effects, convulsions, or death. And if you're modeling epi data, the data may support moving even further down to 1% or 0.1%. However, we do recommend for comparison across assessments for the same endpoints, if you do step away from the standard BMR, we recommend that you report results for that standard regardless. For continuous data, this is where EFSA and EPA disagree currently or have different standards. In BMDS, there are a number of BMRs that you can use for continuous data. Overwhelmingly, though, you're going to see standard deviation or relative deviation used. Preferentially, the guidance wants users to use whatever biological information they have for the endpoint they're modeling. And if you have what we call a minimal biologically significant response level, use that value. So the example here is if you know a 10% decrease in body weight is adverse, use 10% relative deviation for your BMR. If you're modeling a serum enzyme and you know that a 75% increase in that serum enzyme is or can be considered adverse, use that. We want users to use the biology and the toxicological knowledge they have to set their BMR. Oftentimes, however, you're going to have an absence of biological consideration. You're not going to have good data on which to support the selection of a minimal biologically significant response. And in that case, the EPA recommends the use of a BMR equal to 1 standard deviation of the control mean. And that was recommended previously because the use of that BMR will reflect the variation in the measurement of that endpoint. It is true that a BMR, a standard deviation from one study, is going to differ from a reported standard deviation for the same endpoint in another study, because the standard deviation not only incorporates information about the natural variation of that endpoint, it incorporates experimental error. So that is a recognized deficiency in the use of standard deviation, but EPA considers that a more minor issue than using a standard percent deviation across all endpoints. Recognizing that a 5% decrease in one endpoint is not the same as a 5% decrease in another endpoint. This is an area that there is a lot of room for harmonization, and I think Wout's paper on effect size is a good first step at moving towards harmonization and maybe defining a new way to define the BMR for continuous endpoints. So once you've selected your BMR, you need to select the set of models that you're actually going to apply to your data. And again, there's a tiered system of considerations. If you have a biological rationale for selecting a model, if you're modeling a saturable process, a dichotomous endpoint, that might be a good reason to use the dichotomous Hill model that's in BMDS. Although it's not a model that's in BMDS, you might, if you're modeling a cancer endpoint, you might use the two-stage clonal expansion model. But as with the BMR, typically you're not going to have a biological rationale for using a particular model. Your agency may have made a policy decision regarding which models to use. The EPA's IRIS program for cancer endpoints preferentially uses the multi-stage model for two reasons. It's sufficiently flexible to fit most endpoints, and it provides a degree of consistency across all of our cancer endpoints. EPA's Office of Pesticide programs preferentially uses the exponential models when modeling acetylcholinesterase inhibition data, and that's because they did a fairly large comparison study using different models and showed that the exponential models gave the best results and performed better than the other models, and so they just made a policy decision, and you know, they don't use any other continuous models for that type of data. But often you're not going to have that policy decision or the biological consideration. So modeling is just a mathematical effort where you fit, you know, a set of models against your data. The suite of dichotomous models recommended by EPA and available in BMDS is largely the same as PROST. We do have the dichotomous Hill model for sigmoidal dose responses where the plateau is less than 100% response. And then we do recommend using the quantilinear model, the first degree multi-stage model. The models available and recommended for continuous data differ a little bit more. In one sense, we have more models than PROST. We use the polynomial model and the power model. We use all four forms of the exponential model, but we only have one Hill model. We don't have a nested family of Hill models like PROST does. So in that respect, the continuous models are a little bit more restricted than what's available in PROST. I am not going to step in the boondoggle of talking about restricting the slope parameter. I think Matt is going to address that in his presentation, but EPA guidance currently recommends that you restrict model parameters such as the shape parameter and the slope parameter to restrict highly superlinear dose response curves, and that is all I'm going to say about that. So you've selected your BMR, you've selected the set of models you're going to apply to your data, and now you need to answer the question, do any of your data describe your, or any of your models describe the data well? And we recommend a slightly more maybe onerous or complete determination of fit. For continuous models, we have what we call the tests of interest. And these are just tests to determine, one, whether or not there is a difference in response or variance. And it helps the user answer the question whether or not they addressed and modeled the variance in their data correctly. And then we have a global goodness of fit p-value that we use to determine whether or not the models fit the data across all the doses. We recommend looking at scaled residuals to determine whether or not fit at individual doses is appropriate, so looking at local fit. And then we do recommend a visual inspection of model fitting. So for continuous data, the first test of interest is just a determination of whether or not the responses and or the variances differ amongst dose groups. It's not a trend test per se. It's a pairwise comparison of one dose back to control, the other dose back to control. I think we visually, everybody in the room would look at this dose response and kind of shrug their shoulders and say, well, yeah, there's a response there. You know, the responses do differ from control, and the p-value for test one would back up that visual interpretation. The graph on the bottom maybe is a little bit more problematic. I think some people would look at the observed points and say, you know, there's no response. Other people might look at the central estimate, the model estimate of response, and maybe try to convince themselves that there's a slight trend upwards. But the p-value for test 1 would say, nope, it's greater than 0.05. You can't reject the null hypothesis that there isn't a difference between doses with regard to response and or variance. So at this point, if you were modeling this data, test 1 would tell you, stop, don't go any further. There's not a response. Test 2 and test 3 deal with whether or not the variance in your data is constant or non-constant on the natural scale, and whether or not you modeled that variance correctly. EPA and EFSA differ in terms of the assumed distribution in continuous data. EPA assumes a normal distribution. EFSA assumes log normal distribution. And EFSA makes things a little bit easier because they assume log normal distribution and that the variance is constant on the log scale. And so that's just the assumption, and that's how the modeling is handled. EPA, in assuming that the continuous data is normally distributed, allows users to either assume that the variance is constant or increases or decreases as a power function of the mean. How you model the variance influences the calculation of the BMDL, so the user needs to be able to answer the question whether or not they modeled the data correctly. So all test 2 tells you is whether or not the variances are homogeneous or constant. Test 3 tells you, as the user, did you handle the data well? So if you model data and test 2 is telling you that the variance is constant, but you told the software to model the variance as increasing, test 2 will say, hey, the variances are constant, and test 3 will say, and you did not handle it well, go back and remodel the data assuming constant variance. For dichotomous data and continuous data, BMDS will output a global goodness of fit p-value. It's a chi-squared p-value, and it just tells you how the model predicted estimates differ from your observed data. Small values indicate poor fit. Our recommended cutoff value is 0.1. If you are using a particular model based on some a priori decision, say you're modeling cancer data and you're using the multi-stage model, to the exclusion of all the other models, we recommend a cutoff of 0.05. And so this is a true cut point. So any model that has a p-value less than 0.1, you don't consider anymore. You kind of throw it in the trash bin and you only move forward the models that have a p-value greater than 0.1. If you have poor goodness of fit, there are a number of ways to address this. You can consider dropping the high dose if it appears that the high dose is negatively impacting the low dose fit. If you have a PBPK model available, you might consider using it. Oftentimes, the use of internal dose metrics will linearize dose response and facilitate better fit. And you might consider log transforming the doses. A global goodness of fit p-value tells you generally how a model is fitting the data, but it doesn't tell you how it's fitting at individual dose groups. So you can consider a model that has a really good p-value for global goodness of fit, but it either consistently overestimates the observed responses or it underestimates the observed responses, or it fits the data really well in the high dose region to the detriment of the low dose fit. And we're most interested in models that fit the low dose region very well. So all three of those situations, you would have a high p-value, but your model's really not performing adequately. So we also recommend looking at the scaled residuals. which is just a measure of how closely the model fits at individual points, with 0 equaling an exact fit. Our recommendation is to question scaled residuals with an absolute value of less than 2. So the scaled residual is going to be negative or positive depending on whether or not the model is overestimating or underestimating the actual observed response. And so if you have any scaled residuals that are greater than the absolute value of 2, EPA recommends that you consider not using that model, as there's some region in the dose range where the model is not performing adequately. And then the last is a visual inspection of fit. And this is just from, again, ignoring the whole superlinearity argument. I don't want to step into that. It is a final, check to make sure that you haven't accidentally done something wrong. On the left, we have a multi-stage 3rd-degree model, maybe even a 4th-degree model, where we have unrestricted the beta parameters. Multi-stage model beta parameters are usually restricted to be positive. But here, say I accidentally undid that check mark in the option screen in BMDS, and what I would get here, statistically, this would tell me I have a perfect fit. My p-value would be 1 and all my scaled residuals would be 0. And if I just used those criteria, I would think, hey, I got a really good fit, but we get this little roller coaster shape, which is not biologically plausible at all. And so just looking at the plot, I would immediately know what I did wrong, go back, restrict the beta parameters, and get a demonstrably, a model with demonstrably poorer fit, but this model still has a p-value greater than 0.1 and no scaled residual greater than the absolute value of 2. So statistically, this model fits the data and would be the model that you should use, not this one. So visual inspection of the plot is important as just a final check to make sure that there's nothing too crazy going on in how you modeled the data. So, at this point, you've selected all the models that statistically fit the data well. Our guidance is currently set up to pick a final model, but the guidance was cognizant of model uncertainty and model dependence, and so steps 4 and 5 in the workflow I showed earlier get to the point of how do you pick that final model. The central question is determining whether or not the BMDLs and all the adequately fitting models are sufficiently close. And sufficiently close is a what we call a weasel word. It doesn't mean anything. It's not intuitive, and it doesn't, point someone to a good final answer. What is sufficiently close for one risk assessment might not be sufficiently close for another risk assessment. In previous versions of the guidance, it was pretty prescriptive that a threefold cutoff or range is what everybody should be using. But in the final version, we backed off and recognized that, again, what's good for one risk assessment is not necessarily good for another one. So we leave up to the risk assessors to determine what sufficiently close is, with the recommendation that it generally should not be more than threefold. So you have a set of models that that good p-values, scaled residuals are low, they statistically fit the data well. You look at the BMDLs to determine whether or not they're sufficiently close. And the question that you're trying to answer right now is there any model dependence in the data? Is your data adequate such that all the models are returning fairly similar results? And in that case, the guidance recommends that you use AIC as the final determinant for selecting a model. Pick the model with the lowest AIC. However, if your data is such that you've got a wide range in BMDL, so they're not sufficiently close, one model or maybe a couple of models are giving you BMDLs that are, a little bit lower than the BMDLs for the other models. In that case, to be health protective, in acknowledging that there is model dependence in your modeling results, we recommend that you pick the model with the lowest BMDL. And if your models are sufficiently close and you do end up picking models based on AIC, if multiple models have the same AIC, EPA recommends that you combine the BMDLs, but we don't tell you how to do that, which is not very fair to you. So you might choose to do a weighted average or just a straight average, or take the harmonic mean. But I would consult a statistician to answer that question if you get into this situation where you have multiple models with the same AIC. Step 6 is just document your analysis. This is an example of a summary table for dichotomous data and continuous data. We also have a template that we use for appendix material that will give the modeling results for all the models, and then the detailed output for the model that you ended up selecting. So just an example to show how EFSA and EPA, using EFSA guidance and EPA guidance, you might get slightly different results. Using the thyroid vacuolization data and EFSA's current workflow, non-model averaging workflow, where you look at the AIC null and the AIC min, and then pick all the models that are within 2 units from the AIC min. For the thyroid vacuolization data, you would select the log probit and the log logistic model, and you would select the lowest BMDL from these 2 models, 1.84. You would pick the highest BMDU, 5.11. Using EPA methods, you fit all the models to the data, and the first thing you notice is that no model has a p-value greater than 0.1. So this might be a flag not to use this data using EPA's guidelines. But if this were the only data set you had and you didn't want to use the NOAEL approach, you might relax that p-value cutoff. So if you relax it to 0.05, you'll notice that the log probit is the log probit and the log logistic are the only models that give you a p-value greater than 0.05. I don't have the scaled residuals listed here, but all the scaled residuals are less than an absolute value of 2. And in this case, the 2 BMDLs are within a range of 3, 1.84, 1.97. And so we would pick the model with the lowest AIC, which in this case is the log probit. Currently, BMDS does not output BMDUs. That will be fixed in the next version of BMDS, which should be released, I think, within the month. Looking at a continuous example, again, fitting the Hill and exponential model 3 and 5 to this body weight data. You run through the workflow. You would get the lowest BMDL of 0.198 from the exponential model, 3rd degree, and the largest BMDU would be 4.12 from the Hill. Looking at the data and using EPA methods, we would fit, again, all the exponential models, the single Hill model we have, polynomial models, so the linear model, the poly 2 model in the case of this data because we have 4 dose groups, and the power model. All our tests of fit, the variance, the global goodness of fit, and the scale residuals indicate good fit. We've got 4 dose groups. The exponential 5 and the Hill model have 4 parameters that were estimated. These models are considered saturated because the number of parameters equal the number of dose groups. So BMDS doesn't output a p-value for these models. We don't consider them any further given that they are saturated. So we throw them out of consideration. Amongst all the data or all the fitting models, we look at the BMDLs. The BMDLs are within a range of 3, so we would select the linear model in this case due to the lowest AIC. So our BMDL would be 0.226, which is just a little bit higher than the BMDL that would be selected using the EFSA method of 0.198. As I alluded to earlier, EPA does commonly update our modeling practices when the need arises, when an issue comes up in the literature or a particular issue comes up in a particular assessment. We will update our modeling practices without formally updating our guidance. And examples of these include we have a new analysis workflow for modeling cancer data with the multi-stage model to address the tendency of the multi-stage model to estimate parameters on a boundary more often than other models. Approximation methods to account for litter effects when you only have summary statistics. Oftentimes, if you're modeling developmental data, BMDS does have nested dichotomous models that can take into account litter effects and use a litter-specific covariate, but you have to have individual animal data, and that's not often the case when you're modeling data from published studies. And then EPA, the statistical working group, is currently discussing maybe incorporating the use of AIC weights in model selection more explicitly. Other issues are the use of historical controls and how to do that. The guidance does acknowledge that sometimes it may be advantageous to use historical controls, but how you do that is not prescriptively outlined in the guidance. And then what to do when you have a lack of fit for variance in your models. I'm at my 30-minute limit. I want to give Matt plenty of time to discuss the WHO approach. If anybody wants to discuss any of these approaches and updates to our modeling procedures offline, I'd be happy to discuss those with you, but I'll turn it over to Matt. Do you want to take discussion at the end, or?
Well, I think it's reasonable to allow for a few questions specific to the EPA software and not shifting everything to the end.
Yeah.
I think 5 minutes discussion is fine. Any questions, remarks? Not going into too many technical details, please.
This is small question. What do you mean by variance, lack of variance?
So again, EPA recommends using or assuming the normal variant, the normal distribution for continuous endpoints. If you have variances that, so the software BMDS right now can either handle a constant variance, so your variances are constant on all the doses, or variances that increase or decrease as a power function of the mean. But if you have variances that bounce around, you'll get poor fit, you'll get a poor p-value for that test 3, and the statistical working group is discussing how to handle that and what to do in situations such as that.
Question on the back.
Yes, thank you. Well, being a risk assessor, I'm most worried at the starting point to decide to select the BMR. Mm-hmm. And from what you presented, I've made a note that it represents a minimal biologically significant response, such as a 10% body weight. To my understanding, this reflects something like an adverse effect. So it is somewhat contradictory or not clear to what we heard yesterday in the principle for setting BMR. So what are the criteria to set a BMR? Is it like to decide what the adverse effect is, like a 10% increase in body weight is considered as adverse, so that's a BMR, or 20% in cholinesterase inhibition, so that's a BMR?
I think it's just a slight difference in nomenclature. The guidance uses the phrase minimally biologically significant effect level. You can consider that to be an adverse effect level. You want to, if you are using biology or toxicology to set your BMR for continuous endpoints, you want that BMR to be meaningful. You want it to represent a change in the biology. You don't want to just say, I'm going to use 5%, in the context of EPA guidance, where our default, our standard is 1 standard deviation, if you step away from that and use a percent change, we want you to base that on biology. We don't want it to be, well, I'm just going to use 10%, I'm going to use 5%. What that percent value is should reflect what you know about the endpoint you're modeling, and should reflect, again, the specific phrase the guidance uses is minimally biologically significant effect. If you want to consider that to be an adverse level, you know, at that point it's just a difference in nomenclature. It means the same thing.
I think this question will come back in the general discussion at the end, and I really think this is a key issue and is often leading to different views, because selecting the BMR, even in the wording biologically significant response, does not address whether that biological response is adverse or not. It can be a biologically significant response, which is considered as a reactive and adaptive response, or it could be an adverse response. That doesn't tell you. It's really the task of a risk assessor to decide where is the borderline between a response and when that response becomes adverse. That cannot be solved solely on statistical criteria. That needs to be considered, and that will come back. One last final. No, so we move on, and I would like to ask Matt Wheeler to take the floor. Matt is working at the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health and is one of the authors of Model Averaging, and he will present the outcome of the last JECFA meeting, how JECFA is doing the modeling. Matt, please.
Before I begin, I want to kind of clarify some of the things that said yesterday, because it was mentioned that it might seem that modelers tend to disagree, and that lowers the actual certainty we would want to talk about in terms of using the benchmark dose approach. I think that that's kind of an unfortunate thing, but the reality is Val and I agree more than we disagree, and I actually agree with him to a point on the use of unrestricted models before I get into my slides. So I just didn't necessarily fully agree. I like to play devil's advocate. I didn't necessarily fully agree with the argument. So with that statement, you could just have pity on my wife, because it happens a lot more with her than anything else. So if we can get to the slides, how do I get to the slides from here? Just keep moving. Or am I going backwards? No, you're on. I am. You just have, So this is essentially our thought process of what we did at the last JECFA, to kind of give you an idea of where we're thinking and what we were thinking. So I want to give you an overview of the WHO process of benchmark dose estimation, and I'm going to cover a short history of past guidance, what has been done, current practice, what was done at the 83rd meeting, and then some issues that have been raised throughout. So general modeling issues that have been addressed in different ways. I'll stress model averaging, not necessarily because I was one of the people that did it, but because it's I think a very good scientific way forward. And then future directions, what the most recent committee would like to see in the future. So that's kind of the order. And so prior to 2006, health-based guidance values were primarily derived from NOAELs just to define a point of departure, and everything went from there. But as was mentioned, we've been talking about this for 10 years in terms of the benchmark dose approach. So in 2006, at the 64th meeting, the benchmark dose was used to define a point of departure and calculate the margin of exposure. This was done for several genotoxic carcinogenesis In 2009, document was published which gave guidance on dose response modeling and the development of health-based guidance. Now, health-based guidance values may be derived from either the NOAELs or the BMDs, BMDLs in particular. For BMD estimation, it was emphasized that the data should have a sufficient number of doses. Again, sufficient is a kind of a weasel word. What is sufficient? The dose response model should fit the data adequately by some predefined criterion. Here, p-value of 0.1. And goodness of fit is kind of one of those things where you're thinking of the 0.1 is really, if this model really was true, what is the probability that I would have observed this data given it's true? So 0.1 says it's reasonably high probability that I would have observed this data. Anything below that, you start to think, but even 0.1, well, 0.05 is still reasonable. So that's one of those things where dose response modeling should adequately fit the data. The point of departure should be estimated within the range of the observed data. Here again, 10% is the magical number that keeps coming up as BMR. So for dichotomous data, BMR, continuous data, it's a little bit different. And then you have to think sometimes epidemiology data changes depending upon the size of the study and other things you have. And then the BMD sensitivity to model choice should be investigated. We've talked a lot about how the models themselves estimate different benchmark doses and benchmark dose lower bounds. And that sensitivity in your modeling practice needs to be investigated. So we need to look at that seriously to talk about the uncertainty. Now, at the 72nd meeting of JECFA, the committee reaffirmed the commitment to benchmark dose methodology. And it made the recommendations at first, in accordance with the 64th meeting, the lowest BMDL is to be chosen. And for 2-year animal tox studies, the BMR is now 10%. Though other levels may be more appropriate for human data, and recommended the use of appropriate software that's available. Now, presently, it's the US EPA's BMDS software or PROST package. So those are generally the packages that are used, but other software might be appropriate if it's available. And the big one is recommended the establishment of a working group to address several issues to harmonize the benchmark dose, and I think that's kind of why we're here today. So at its 83rd meeting, there was a lot of fireworks, and the committee reaffirmed the need to establish a working group because there were a lot of different things that were needed. And the one thing that we all agreed upon is we all liked model averaging. We liked it as a tool, but there was no guidance to use it, so we couldn't use it in general without the actual guidance of using model averaging. We wanted to talk about the use of when to use constraints and when not to use constraints, and I'll talk about that as we go forward, kind of the argument why we use constrained models over unconstrained models. And recommended approach that really makes the statistics, the modeling, and the toxicology complementary as a joint unit in the risk assessment process versus something that might be not contradictory but seemingly having different truths that they're talking about, just joining those together to making a complete science. Review the use of a goodness of fit criteria and review new developments in the software, so BMDS as well as PROS. And so what's following is a brief version of that rationale, what happened at the 83rd meeting. So I'm going to start with the risk assessment that is the big kind of risk assessment that we worked at. So 3 MCPD esters. Barbara, if I get anything wrong, just stand up and tell me. So we're going to consider data from the Cho et al. Study 2008. This particular was the critical endpoint, renal tubular hypoplasia, which was the critical endpoint. And it's rare that you have a study that also has a previous study. So there's another study with almost identical results. But this study had the lowest BMDL, so this is what everything was based upon. But there's a Sunahara study which, for male rats, almost had identical results. So we had some comparison of what to look at. So what we did was fit all the restricted models and then we unrestricted. You notice that there's only 4 unrestricted models. And you'll find that in the restricted case, there's only one model that fit with the p-value, the log logistic. Its p-value is 0.61. None of the other models fit the data. But when you unrestrict the gamma, the log logistic, the log probit, and the Weibull, they all fit the data. But then you have this question, well, what happens to the BMD, BMDL? And the BMD drops a lot, by about half, but the BMDL, the lowest BMDL, is now an order of magnitude different. And so the question really becomes, what do we do? Do we trust this model? Do we trust what's going on? And there was a lot of discussion, actually, believe it or not. I was on the side of unrestricted models at JECFA. And so why? Should you use unrestricted models or should you use restricted models? So there's a case for unrestricted models. Now, my case for unrestricted models is a statistical one. And it's basically saying, from a statistical point of view, my confidence interval, my BMDL that I specify, I say 95%, is only valid if it's within the interval. So if I hit a parameter estimate on a bound, all my statistics become invalid. That's just it's a statistical fact. So the result is the confidence intervals aren't correct. But then there's the case for the restricted models. An unrestricted model makes no sense. Now, that could be argued, but if you assume a one-hit cancer model, something like the quantilinear model is the most dangerous model you could have, the model that shows the most risk. Well, the unrestricted models will violate this assumption. And they violate this assumption and give estimates that are unrealistic. They give risks that are too low. So based upon these considerations, we argued extensively that the unrestricted models were far too conservative. Now, this is the other part of the information. For other data, the Sunahara et al., male and female rats point to a very similar BMD, BMDL. The BMD was about 1.2 in the Sunahara study, and the BMDL was like 1, where in the Cho study, if you use the restricted model, you got a BMD of 0.87. So you're having different data sources give you this pretty much the same answer. And in the Sunahara study, restricted or unrestricted didn't matter. There's actually an artifact of what happens in the data, and I'll show you a little bit, that really, if by chance we would have seen one more rat or one less rat observed with the condition, the whole model changes and the results become more sensible. So there's just the chance of seeing one different rat changes how we view it, and it changes it by an order of magnitude. So we also looked at model averaging, and that gives nearly an identical result to what we did. And that's kind of what I would like to say with model averaging. Unrestricted models were used. It doesn't matter as much to use unrestricted models in model averaging. So if everybody's recommending model averaging, I say use unrestricted models. That's the way to go. If you're not using model averaging, there's still some questions. So issues raised. As the point of departure chosen by JECFA is 0.87, it's an order of magnitude greater than what EFSA used, using the exact same data and the exact same model suite. So which approach is correct? Harmonization. What do we use? And what does one do if a new method suggests a different point of departure using the exact same data set, which was already used in a previous decision? This was already given a previous decision based on the NOAEL that actually, it was strange that we raised the recommended guidance from what the previous decision was based upon the method. So there were a lot of issues raised and a lot of issues that have to be discussed. So the statistical and toxicological knowledge, merging them. Okay, so for the discussion, I'm going to throw out my one equation, and it's what was brought up in the discussion a lot at JECFA was the Weibel model. Now, the Weibel model, the restriction unrestricted, it's that alpha up there that really is the parameter that we worry about the restriction. If that goes less than 1, we start to have some questions. If it's greater than 1, we're okay. And if we estimate it greater than 1, statistically and a toxicological standpoint, we agree. It's what happens at that 1 boundary, a little bit below or possibly above. So the BMDL, I'm going to say computing it is questionable, often will fit a model that makes sense and it looks really nice. But it's the BMDL computation that really starts to become questionable. Crudely, we can think of the statistical of our argument as follows. So we like to assume normality for everything. It's based on the math. But if you place a bound on the value, normality doesn't apply. We know it doesn't apply because normality has 2 tails. A normal distribution has 2 tails. We've cut off 1 tail. We've made it so 1 tail doesn't exist. And it includes all functions of the derived parameters like the BMD. As you can see, the BMD is equal to all the derived parameters. So if I truncate one of those parameters, any estimated quantity from there is automatically suspect. So using our traditional assumptions without normality, standard testing doesn't apply. We can't produce reliable confidence intervals. So pictorially, I like to think of this. Well, you have the normal distribution, and then I truncate it. Now, what you'll notice is that the height of the distribution changes when I truncate it. So the probability is changing as I truncate it, and we don't have anything that's necessarily accounting for that. There's a lot of things going on statistically that cause you to question your confidence interval. But when we say now the BMDL is counting for the statistical uncertainty in the experiment, we're not really quantifying that anymore. By making that truncation, we're no longer saying that we're quantifying the statistical uncertainty, and that's a problem. Now, you might say, you know, it is a 95% lower bound, but it's often nowhere even close. I've seen coverage of such things where if I nominally want a 95% confidence limit, I'm getting a 16% confidence limit. So that's not even the median. You expect the central estimate to be 50%. So we're so far below that. So you can get incredibly poor statistical properties if you truncate it. So as a statistician, I was taking that point at JECFA. But Clark, who's not here, but I'm sure he would love to add to the conversation, would say that models considered below the restriction are nonsense and thus should not be used based upon other knowledge. Basically, the toxicologist needs to come into the discussion and say, this doesn't make sense. We can't use this because of basic chemistry, basic toxicology. And the argument has credibility because toxicology is a science just as statistics is a science. You have knowledge that needs to come into the discussion for a risk assessment. So I'm going to revisit it and use the Weibull model since simple. The gamma model actually had the lowest BMDL, but the Weibull model is the easiest to visualize as a parameter. So I'm going to refit the model to get the BMDL. So what is actually happening in a BMDL? We're refitting the model. We're iteratively refitting it until the model is bad enough by some statistical criterion, and that badness, that change, is enough to say 95%. So I'm basically estimating my BMDL using a model. It's never really shown in BMDS, and I don't know if PROST does it. Does PROST show the upper bound? Okay, so yeah, the log likelihood profile, the upper bound of that. But if you don't see that upper bound, and you don't start to think about that upper bound because that's where the BMDL is being calculated, does that model itself make sense? Alan talked about looking about the model fit. Does that make sense? Well, that upper bound model, does that make sense? That's another question. So the lower bound of the Weibull model. So what it's saying is the majority of the increase in probability would happen at really low doses. So what we observed in the data set, about 50% of the renal tubular hyperplasia would be seen at doses of about 0.1. So of the response, the majority of that response is happening very early. And then after that, it slowly increases. That's what the lower bound model is actually saying. It's saying it's happening all initially, and then slowly after that, it's happening. And the implication is that this chemical is incredibly dangerous early at low doses, and that's where we're seeing all of our response. And after that, other biological processes kick in, and it doesn't really matter too much. So the question comes up from this is, well, can model averaging save you from the situation? Unfortunately, though it provides a reasonable answer in this case, it's not always going to be the case that it always saves you. It's better. So the 2007 version is much better in the unrestricted cases, but it's not a panacea. It's not going to save you every time. There are better solutions to this. The EPA and I are working on a fully Bayesian approach, which would allow for unrestricted models, but to include toxicological knowledge. So really the only way you would have a model that goes below, say, the alpha parameter going below 1, the only way you would get that is if the data, there were a lot of data that really supported that. And if there wasn't a lot of data, you're not necessarily going to get the crazy models. And then we've seen a lot of in this method, and it's very promising. It actually is outperforming my 2008 work. And some of the next issues are very more practical. What do you do when a new statistical method suggests a different point of departure? We had already analyzed in past JECFA meetings this substance. It changed the point of departure. What do we think about the credibility of risk assessment science when there's no new data, but there's a new statistical method? I would like to say it's in the same realm of a new data set because it's a new method. It's an advancement on one side of the science. It's not an It's not an advancement on new data, but it's an advancement on another side of science, but some people might disagree. And that often will cause concern in the public who doesn't understand the methodologies that we use. And is there a range where this difference is okay and we do nothing? Is there just a small little, okay, it gives a slightly different answer. After that, it's big enough that we really have better science, we need to change it. Does this make science less transparent? And then one may argue that current practice is to be health protective. What we want to do is protect the public health. If we have something that comes along that's also health protective, have we fulfilled our mandate and said, we know this is better and we're still being health protective? So there's much to discuss regarding the approaches that we talked about at JECFA, and harmonizing the BMD approach between all stakeholders, I think, would increase the reproducibility of risk assessments and kind of make things like what happened, between two bodies, EFSA and JECFA, less alarming. I think the public might see the value that we put out and then the value EFSA put out, which are an order of magnitude different, and be alarmed and say, well, are they even doing science? Are they just picking a number? So thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt. Any questions? I'm sure there are. It's particularly tricky issue because 3-MCPD esters are touching on another sensitive end, namely that it occurs also in infant formula. And that has immediately triggered a lot of reactions in the public, and it's very difficult really to discuss this in a public way, not because it's very difficult to explain this kind of apparent discrepancies. And as you were saying, I was hoping that at least when using model averaging, that would solve the problem. I forgot to say, don't forget to switch off the mobiles. Any comments on this from the floor?
Can I also have a question?
Yeah.
No, I was just thinking, you were using the models. In general, the models have these restrictions, but if you reparameterize the model, you could just make a model to be unrestricted. If instead of using just the alpha as this exponent, for instance, in the Weibull model, you would use a reparameterization of this parameter alpha to be on the full range scale, would that give you a different results? Or did you try something about that? Or
No.
Because maybe just reparameterizing the models not to have any restriction in the parameters could also help, and then people would use exactly the same model.
Well, I think from an issue of maximum likelihood, if I reparameterize the model, I should at least better well get the same model fit. It might help in terms of some of the statistical theory in terms of the credible interval, or the confidence intervals. Sorry, I'm a Bayesian, I say credible intervals. But I don't know if it's going to get us away from the final problem of the BMDL being so low and the model. So that would be an interesting thing to look at and explore. I didn't explore it.
There was a question somewhere over there.
But it's a different one, maybe.
Wout?
Matt, it's good that you removed the potential misunderstanding that we completely disagree about this constraint. And actually, I agree also with your additional argument, which is a purely statistical one. I think that's another argument. I still have some difficulty with the slide you showed on the dose response curve a little bit earlier. Maybe you could go back there. Where you said that most of the response occurs at low doses, and at higher doses, well, there's a relatively small change. But when you look at the numbers on the dose scale, then you see that this smaller change in response occurs between somewhere 0.02 and 0.10, which is only a factor of 5. So this is a very, very small change in dose, actually.
Well, that's...
And the range below 0.02 is a very, very large range, which I tried to make clear yesterday. So therefore, the argument that biologists make, and I know they made this, and I bought that same argument for a couple of years, but I did not realize at that point, and I think you still don't realize that now at the same still, and I hope you get this insight as well, that this is a very small dose step. And there's a huge dose step when you go down from 0.02 to 0, because you can go down by 10-fold, again by 10-fold, and you can do that something like 20 times, or 23 times when you think of the number of Avogadro. So I think the argument itself sounds very plausible at first sight, but when you think of it, it doesn't make much sense, because you don't take into account the step you are making in the change in the doses.
And I would respond to look at my argument would be based upon first order kinetics, and first order kinetics basically are dependent upon the number of molecules in a suspension. So it's essentially proportional to the number of molecules in a suspension. Now, the dose on the original scale is proportional to the number of molecules. So in first order kinetics, that rate of change is at least continually, the derivative is important. Once I take the log of that, my dose is no longer proportional to the number of molecules. It's a different value. So I agree that you can take the log, but from first order kinetics and chemistry, I need to be proportional to the number of molecules in a suspension, and once I take the log, I'm no longer proportional. That's my response.
Okay, well, I think we should talk about this another time, because this is going to take very long.
Okay, Angelika.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry if I have a naive question, being not a statistician. Going into your Bayesian approaches, you're working on ways so you can have an opportunity to have more toxicology input or toxicology knowledge. How does that work? Through weighting of models or what?
The way that we're thinking now, and we had some of these discussions last night, but I think it's going to be an evolving issue. We have historical information. We know what a genotoxic carcinogen looks like. We know what carcinogens from secondary mechanisms like inflammation often look like. So we have some idea. There are bases in the toxicology to know when something's genotoxic and when something's not. So we can look at historical data and say, well, this group of chemicals over here behaves in a genotoxic way. These are the dose response curves that we've seen for these chemicals. Now, if that's the case, we can use that information as a prior into our models and saying, well, then our model should kind of look like this. And then we should say, well, we also want to put more weight on the models that really support the genotoxic carcinogenesis hypothesis. So when we do the modeling, we would arguably say, this is a set that you want to look at. Now, if we don't think it's a genotoxic carcinogen, we can look at another set of models, and we can say, well, these are the data sets that we have extant of risk assessments, and these are what the dose response shapes look like. So we can use another set of beliefs on that set and then put weights based upon those previous historical. And it would be important to say that what we don't do is put so much weight that we already have the curve. You can be a Bayesian to the point where your prior distribution is your answer. I mean, because your posterior, the data doesn't change anything. But if we build it correctly, we will gain information and be more correct. We'll be able to add historical controls, for instance, in a way that's reasonable and get a better estimate in the end. We're seeing now, Alan talked about yesterday with the model averaging the quantilinear case, and I always looked at that as the worst case, one hit, just the simplification of the one hit cancer model, and that was always the worst case. And that was a case I could never get coverage. I could never get the nominal 95%. I could get close, but I could never get it. And in this new method, with a little bit of the Bayesian flavor, we're getting 95% coverage for that. In almost all cases we've seen, we have 23 simulation conditions right now. And right now I've ran it against about 50,000 simulated data sets, and I'm hitting coverage in almost all of the cases. So we're doing a really good job, if that helped.
More questions, remarks? Maybe one final question from my side. Yesterday we discussed about the impact of the number of dose groups, and I'm pretty sure that this type of problems we have seen with acrylamide, we see it with the issue of 3-MCPD. That will continue as long as we have only 3 dose groups. Now, if we use the same number of animals but spread it out over 6 or 7 dose groups, what is actually the impact? Is there a lowest number of animals per dose groups to be used? Meaning you can, if you use 50 animals and you spread these 50 animals over 50 dose groups, yes, as an extreme case, wouldn't you then introduce another type of uncertainty?
Actually, from a statistical standpoint, Wout definitely has some opinions on what he said yesterday, but from a statistical standpoint, the more dose groups, the better. And it would actually be better, especially the high doses, the very high doses where we know there's going to be a saturation of response anyway, to only have, instead of 50 animals, 10 animals. And then allocate those rats to the lower end of the scale so we get better information. I think it, however, is often a situation of just resources. Just because I don't think the lab technician wants to feed, if you've got a standard NTP study, you've got 200 animals, they want to feed each animal something different. I think the costs would be astronomical. So we have to balance between the resources to do it and the statistical gain. She's coming.
Thank you. To add to this, we did quite some simulations to study the impact of the number of dose groups and with the total number of animals fixed. And what you see generally is that if you have 4 dose groups, then the performance tends to be lower, so you get wider confidence intervals. When you go to 6, it improves, and when you go to 7, 8, then maybe it improves a little bit, but when you go to 50, it doesn't really improve very much. It just stays the same. Mm-hmm. So that is good news, because then you know there's no really a good reason to make this expensive. So it is better to use more dose groups, but you don't need to think about 50 dose groups. There's something like 7 or 8 is great. Another important argument to use more dose group is not only because that what people would say, this is better for the BMD approach because the BMD approach is not the goal, as I said earlier. The goal is to get good information, and you can show that the BMD confidence intervals will tend to be somewhat smaller with 6 or 8 dose groups. But an important argument to use more dose groups is that this lowers the probability of unfortunate dose location. So if there is a dose where all animals die, and you have 8 dose groups, then the impact of that is relatively small, instead of using 4 dose groups, because then you lose much more animals. So that is one of the things that is an advantage, and in particular when you are not completely sure about, let's say you are not completely sure about what dose to choose, then more dose groups is less risky from this simple point alone. And of course there are some other reasons, but please look at my papers.
Final question from Angelika.
It's just a direct follow-up. Thanks, Wout. And I take advantage of having you here instead of reading the paper. But did you check the impact of the N per dose group?
The N per dose group doesn't matter. So the N per dose group is essential in the NOAEL approach, because you compare different, you have pairwise comparison, but in the dose response analysis, you just use all the animals. You describe all the animals, and you can, I should have a paper to show it, but you can think of one dose group, one animal per dose group. What you get is just a nice increase of the response, and immediately you see that the dose response is very well determined. That doesn't really make a difference.
There's one other thing to say. The background is actually one of the hardest things to actually estimate. When you're increasing your response, statistically you have a lot more power showing an increasing response versus just a static mean. So I've noticed, if you think it's reasonable to include historical controls or some larger value, I've noticed large gains in performance by that background, because what we're basically saying is in benchmark dose calculation is always referent to the background. If it's added risk or exit risk, it's always in a referent to the background. And the way I like to think of it is, if it's a boat that's either floating in the water or anchored. Now, if it's anchored, it can only go certain far depending upon the length of the chain. Well, if it's just floating in the water, it can go at a much further distance because it's not anchored. So the more we anchor that background value, the better information we get about the shape of the actual dose response curve. So that's something to be considered in the future. That's not just to talk about the dose response curve, the number of dose groups, but that background response is very important.
Yes, I totally agree. And what you see in practice quite often is that, as you should know, there may be errors in dose groups. So sometimes you see an outlying dose group which doesn't behave like the other dose groups. And that could be some unknown experimental factor which caused this deviation. And if this happens in the controls, of course, then you have quite a big problem, because this is an important observation in the controls. So you might also consider in an optimal study design to use, let's say, 2 or maybe even 3 different control groups, so that you have some handle on what could be the potential error in my treatment of the animals, which is a little bit different in the controls as in the other dose groups, and then you have a better stable anchor, I would say, for the rest of the study. So in general, you might say use a little bit more animals in the lower doses and a little bit less animals in the higher doses, but try to spread your information over the whole dose range and have more dose groups than we use now. This, having said so, 4 dose groups is just suitable in principle for the dose response analysis.
Okay, I think it's time for coffee. We can continue over coffee until 11:30. Be back at 11:30. Okay, this is the final session now, and there is a discussion, and it's foreseen for short introductory remark. I will start off, but as this is a discussion session, and please be reminded to use the microphones properly so that the people following this discussion over the internet can also hear you. That's one thing. Then the other thing I would just like to start off with the discussion is following up what was said just before the coffee break. If we have a difficult data set like 3MCPD, and we have heard about reparameterization of models and things like that, I really think that also points to the need for EFSA having a standing working group on benchmark dose modeling, and also in the outside world that you then really consult a specialist modeler, because what I really fear, if lay modelers like myself start fine-tuning model parameters, not knowing exactly what they or I am doing, then that leads to a complete mess. So I think really when doing fine-tuning of models, that should be done only by people really deeply into the modeling issue, and not just by lay people just trying to change parameters and then finally end up with a BMDL which seems to be acceptable. That's not acceptable, in my view. Secondly, I think the issue of number of dose group is really an issue, but that's little we can do, because that will take quite some time, because that would touch upon OECD guidelines, number of animals used per dose groups, number of dose groups. And I realized that there are already ongoing efforts to address these issues. Finally, what is in the program, I should say some words about the selection of the BMR. I think we have addressed this already several times. And to me, this is clearly linked to the background variability. And if you select blindly the BMR as a default, I personally think that even when selecting a default BMR for modeling your endpoint, you should, in the output, give a rationale what you think this BMR means in terms of a biological response, even if you select the background. Because, as we have seen, modeling body weight is not the same as modeling, I don't know, liver weight. That may have a different background variability, or if it comes, especially of course for continuous data, the problem in my view is not even given for quantal data, because there I think it's obvious. Thanks. Thanks for reminding me how I name myself. So sometimes I tend to forget, so that's good. Yes, selecting this BMR is a crucial issue, and we have heard it's also an issue in modeling, because the background variability has a big influence. And be reminded that benchmark dose modeling, in my view, doesn't solve the problem what you think this BMR you have selected is. What is the biological meaning of that? You need to address this. What is a 10%, 7% decrease in body weight? And that is linked, in my view, what is the biological meaning? Is it an adaptive response? And when does this response, as I have said earlier on, is becoming adverse? This question cannot be solved by modeling alone, and needs input from toxicologists modeling this endpoint. I would like to stop at this point and maybe we just go around the table, collect these views, and then open up the discussion. Wout, would you like to start a second?
So I completely agree that sorry. In the end, the choice of the BMR is a biological question. The practice is that this is for most, well, I think for all biologists, a difficult question to answer for all endpoints. And so one thing that statistics, or let's say quantitative methods, may contribute is that we can at least give a first suggestion for choosing the BMR, and that is what I have tried to make clear in my paper on effect size theory, where you can see that you could think of scaling the percent change for the benchmark response using the maximum response of that specific endpoint, and as a surrogate use the within group scatter of that endpoint. And well, I do have some slides, but to maybe at least give us a little bit clear what I intend to do, because it is, well, actually, apart from giving us a first suggestion of how you could select the benchmark response for each single endpoint, and then later on, of course, as a biologist, you can may have a look at it and say, well, does this sound reasonable or not at all? The other thing is that, as I said earlier, this sort of harmonizes the EFSA approach with the EPA approach, where they, well, which says that a benchmark response 1SD may be a good option for those cases where you are not able to find a good percent change value. So if you want, I can do that. It's about 4 or 5 slides, if time allows it.
Well, I think it would be good, because I got the feeling already yesterday that this is a burning issue and it's coming up again and again. And so maybe, yes, that would be helpful if you could show the slide. So in the meantime, while loading up the slides, I would like to
Joseph, just a second. For the technician, if you can load the presentation number 2. Hello. If you can load presentation number 2 and go to slide number 27.
While loading the file, are there any remarks regarding this already from the floor, from the table up here? Matt, Alan, Jose, Bernard, Tobin? No.
So maybe in the meantime I can already start?
Yep.
So this is a little bit improvising because I did not prepare this, but one of the issues about the within group scatter or the within group standard deviation is that this is sort of a bulk value. It includes many different sources of variation. You can think of simply the measurement error that you made in the observations. So for some endpoints are more difficult to measure than others, so they have a bigger measurement error than others. A very clear example is when you count cells, you may the fraction of cells out of a total number. When your total number is larger, then your measurement error will be smaller. Or when you are weighing organs, and you think about thymus weights, well, they are very small, especially in small rats or small animals. And then, of course, your weighing measurement error will also be relatively large. Other things are that in some studies the experimental conditions. Well, I go to the other. The experimental conditions may be larger than in another may vary to a larger extent than in another study. So all these things you have to keep in mind when you think about the standard deviation in a control group. Okay, so let's have a look at this slide here. The BMR1SD is defined, when we look at the left slide, as a change in the mean response by 1 standard deviation, as indicated here. And then you are going to see at what dose does the curve indicate where this happens, at what dose, BMD. So this is the BMD associated with the BMR1SD. And then, of course, if the variability, the standard deviation in your controls is larger, then you will end up with a higher benchmark dose. That's the direct consequence, as you can see in this graph. That means that when these two situations reflect different endpoints, then you might say, well, that is more or less what I want to do, because I think intuitively that when the variability in one endpoint is larger than in another endpoint, then I should take that into account. And therefore, for this reason, I think that the BMD should be higher. So intuitively, this says, in this way, I can better compare between different endpoints. However, when you compare different target populations, or different populations of organisms, then you see that the BMD1SD in the animal study is smaller than it would be in the human population, even though I assume here that the dose response is exactly the same. So just imagine there is a chemical for which the dose response is exactly the same between rats and humans. Then using the BMD1SD gives you an underestimate of the BMD in humans. It does not directly translate, you see? So this is not so good. And then when you compare different studies, when these two results are from two different studies, it might be that in the first study the measurement error was better than in the other one, or it might be that the experimental conditions were less heterogeneous than in the other one. For instance, temperature was controlled better, or the housing was more homogeneous for the animals, or whatever. And then again, these two BMDs are not really comparable. So you might think that they contradict each other, while in reality, again, the dose response is exactly the same. So these are two of the problems that you'll have with the BMR1SD approach. When you use the percent change approach, and those response curves are identical in two different situations, then you see that the CED, which is the same as the BMDs end up as being the same. So the BMD, when it is related to a BMR in a percent change, is stable. It does not depend on the variability in the controls. So this is okay when we go from rats to humans. And this is also okay when we compare two different studies. The two different studies have the same benchmark dose, or the critical effect dose. However, when we compare endpoints, then we have this problem. We did not take the larger variability in that particular endpoint into account, and we just say, well, 5% is 5%. And this is, well, you might intuitively think that this is maybe not adequate. Okay, in my theory, I don't think, yeah. So, in my theory, what I have tried to do is, well, it provides a theoretical substantiation for the fact that this larger variability in one endpoint compared to another is indeed something that you should take into account. It does make sense to take the natural variability of the endpoint into account. The point, however, is that the natural variability of that particular endpoint is represented by one single value from that single study, and it may be quite different in another study. So therefore, what I'm saying is, let's try to collect a lot of data sets for the same endpoint and take sort of an average value for this one standard deviation, because that represents the typical value for that endpoint, and it is less sensitive to incidental things that happen in single studies. So, there is a rationale for the intuitive notion of taking the natural variability into account. And this derives from a somewhat different assumption, which says that the critical effect size, well, I use the critical effect size notation, it is the same as benchmark response percent change. To define a small benchmark response as 1/8 of the log of the maximum response. This is in this paper, which is now in press. If you would consider this as a good starting point, then you can show, based on an empirical correlation between maximum response and the within group standard deviation in different endpoints, you can derive that this is more or less equal to this second equation. So the log of the benchmark response is approximately equal to 1 standard deviation. And since we assume that we should do the analysis on the log scale, this is quite close to the 1 standard deviation benchmark response. So this gives more or less a theoretical substantiation of the BMR 1SD. The big difference, of course, and I repeat that, the standard deviation that we use here should rather be based on a large number of data sets and use the typical value for this particular type of studies. So maybe in vivo studies, or maybe another value for in vitro studies, so that you can use that as the best estimate of the natural variability of that endpoint. In a relative sense, that is. So, as I just said, this more or less coincides with the BMR 1SD if the analysis is performed on the log response scale. That is really essential, because my theory only holds for the log scale. And the other thing is, I had something in mind, what I wanted to say. Okay, yeah, I now remember. So the other advantage of this approach is that instead of talking, this is the dose associated with the 1 standard deviation change, has not really a very good biological meaning. You don't know what that means for the individual. However, in this approach, you can just calculate this back to the percent change. So it says for this endpoint, when I use the 1SD approach, I have a relative effect size of 20%, and for another endpoint maybe 50%, and for another endpoint maybe 5%. And then you know what we are talking about. And then you can say, as a biologist, okay, do I think this is a reasonable value for the benchmark response? Because I can at least interpret what this quantitative number means. So this is an important second advantage. I think this more or less summarizes.
Thanks, Wout. And to me, it's especially important to stress what you just said at the end. Yes, that's a fallback opportunity if you know that your parameter has a higher background variability, and for continuous data a 5% change is simply meaningless. To at least take this background variability and the maximum response into account. But that doesn't tell you anything about the biological meaning. That's still with you as a risk assessor who needs to look at the data and say whether you think that's a reasonable value. In my view, any benchmark response ideally would be close to that point where the change in your parameter size becomes adverse. So on the borderline between adaptive response and adversity. And that's a tricky issue to agree on with different scientists, but that's not solved by BMD modeling. That's the task of the toxicologist, to agree on where a response becomes adverse. Any other remarks? Questions? Yes, there is one over here.
Yes, it works. I think in addition to the number of doses and number of animals per dose, I think it's also very important to realize the number of doses causing an effect. Because I see more and more that we get papers back where we are blamed to be using too high doses that actually show an effect, and we should have used low doses. And there seems to be a tendency now also of journals and scientists to go for low dose effects and avoid refuse papers that show actually high doses, maybe unrealistic doses initially, unless you apply uncertainty factors. So I think also that's very important to have some guidance on how many doses should be at maybe not at a no effect level, and how many doses should be at a dose level showing an effect. I think that's also very important. Should we go as high to see a maximum effect, or so some guidance there would also be very useful, I think.
I agree with you, but I think that this has in principle nothing to do with the modeling of the dose response. That's addressing the issue of low dose effects, which is an issue in itself. But I agree the number of doses giving a response is also important. If you have 7 dose groups, but only the highest dose gives you a response, then we are in the same situation as if you have only 2 dose groups. Right?
Well, I do think this is a very relevant point. The whole point is that if you use low doses only, you are in the region where you do not see very much. So, and it's very simple. You can just think of this from primary, how do you say that? First principles in statistics, that you need those high doses or those high responses, I should know how to say. Otherwise, you cannot make any inference about the dose response shape, including the reference point. So using low doses only is really a very, very bad idea, and it's very unfortunate. And from the 3 R's perspectives, you can state that of course I realize that high doses may lead to animal suffering. But the reality is that if you use fewer high doses, you need more animals to get the same precision from your data. That's the hard reality. So either you use high doses and fewer animals, or you use low doses, but then you really need more animals. And you can see that from epidemiological studies. Why do they use so many people? Because the effects are very small. Next to the fact that the scatter is larger, but also because the effects are very small. So this is really a very hard reality that you cannot deny. And the issue of testing at realistic doses, to me, is, I don't really understand that argument. So what we want to do is take samples from the dose scale and try to find out where does the response starts to increase. And that's exactly what you want to know. And now say, well, maybe that is not realistic dose. Well, it doesn't matter, because from the reference point, we go back by using interspecies scaling and intraspecies scaling, and then just compare that to the exposure. So this is the full story, and there's nothing wrong with that. And there's no reason at all to test at realistic doses. Because if your reference point is much higher than the exposure, that's fine. No problem. But then you have really good information to state, okay, my reference point is really much higher than my exposure. And you have a very firm risk assessment conclusion. And using low doses is very uncertain, and you really don't know what you are doing. And I think the main reason that people think in this way is that they still are in the old-fashioned way of thinking, do I see an effect? Yes, then there is an effect. Do I not see an effect? Then there is no effect. And that is the thing that was really wrong, as I tried to explain earlier.
Other remarks? If not, I think we move on to models to be used and their parameters. It's again about saying something.
Yes, well, I'm not sure if there are still many discussion points left here. So in summary, what we have shown during this workshop is that we have so far only 2 models for the continuous data. We have a whole suite of models for the quantal data. For the quantal data, and for the continuous data, we know pretty well that they are able to describe real data. This was systematically reviewed, as I made clear. For quantal data, such an effort is still ongoing. So maybe when this work is finished, we have a better handle on what models are more likely to describe our dose response data than other models. Maybe we can use that for prior weights in the Bayesian approach that Matt was talking about. Maybe this, and maybe we can also, and that would be, I think, a very great advantage of the benchmark dose approach, is that we can use prior information from historical dose response data. So not historical controls, but historical dose response data. If we see that the shape parameters are always in a particular range, then we can use that as prior information. And if the single data set that you are analyzing does not really provide very good information on the shape parameters, then this is important additional information to be used. And that is all perfectly well possible in Bayesian approaches, and this is a matter of time, I think, before when this will be realized. And that will be very advantageous for getting smaller benchmark dose intervals, even in situations where the data are currently rather inconclusive. So that might help. That might be very helpful. Well, then, of course, regarding the parameters, well, I think the main issue here is the parameter constraint on parameter C or D in continuous data, and well, we have discussed this extensively. I'm happy to continue, but I leave that to the chair.
Or remarks from the floor? I don't see any. Then maybe just picking up the last remark, maybe solved by model averaging. Alan?
So I think if, regarding quantal data, if there's a take-home message that you should go back to your agencies with, is that using model averaging is a demonstrably better approach than single model selection methods that have been used previously. And, you know, maybe the issue's been a little complicated because I've talked about, you know, there's the average model approach, and there's the average dose approach, and there's a frequentist approach, and there's a Bayesian approach. So what the final flavor of model averaging will end up being is maybe not necessarily something you should worry about. It's that we have made incremental improvements. You know, the percent coverages that I showed in my presentation the other day, the 2007 method that EFSA and Prost is using, you know, achieved 63%. 63% of the time it achieved coverage, which is, you know, you want to see it achieve coverage 95% of the time, or hit coverage in all the simulations. But it's demonstrably better than the model selection criteria that Matt used in his paper, which was highest p-value. West et al. Looked at using an AIC approach or a single model approach, and showed coverages were, you know, abysmal, down to 0%. So we've made a lot of improvements, and we are researching, you know, extensions of the model averaging approach, Bayesian methods, which, you know, will get around this issue of whether or not to, you know, constrain or unconstrain your parametric models. And, you know, the method that Matt's developed is, I think 22 out of 23 simulation scenarios, it hits nominal coverage. So it's, you know, almost performing at maximal efficiency. And so maybe in the future we'll switch over to using that model averaging approach, but that's almost, that's happening in the background. The fundamentals between the model averaging approach that EFSA is recommending now and what may be implemented in the future is, behind the scenes. We've addressed, the important message is model uncertainty is being addressed to a greater degree with model averaging versus single model selection. With regard to continuous models, I think it's up in the air whether or not model averaging will be necessary. Wout has his paper that shows, the exponential and the Hill model are flexible enough to fit, the majority of the historical data sets that they analyzed. Matt and myself and colleagues at the EPA have done a comparison of a frequentist continuous model averaging approach and compared it to the one Hill model that is in BMDS. And, the model averaging approach has an incrementally better coverage rate, but the Hill model performs very admirably and hits coverage in almost all the simulation studies. There's been research in the literature, Ringblom et al. 2012 showed if you just look at the exponential models and the entire suite of exponential models and you pick the best one based on likelihood ratio tests, you have terrible coverage rates. If you exclude the exponential 2, your coverage hits like 91%, and it's because the exponential 2 is limited in its flexibility. If you remove it from the considered model suite, your single model selection process works really, really well, and that reflects what EFSA is recommending in the guidance, that you only use the exponential and Hill 3 and 5 models. So, we may get to a situation where we're recommending two different methods for the two different types of data, model averaging for dichotomous, but it's not necessary for continuous data. And then something, I might be dropping a bomb here, but something that has not yet come up in the discussions is the use of non-parametric models. You may address model uncertainty by having a non-parametric model that's so flexible that you only have one model, and in that case you don't have model uncertainty. So.
Can I continue?
Yes.
So I have two things I would like to add. To start with the bomb. I think that the main reason of using or fitting models to data is to try to compensate a little bit for potential errors in your data. And the basic problem of parametric models is that it tends to follow those errors in the data. So this is just, I think we could discuss this for hours, but this is more or less how I think about it in main lines. Anyway, the other thing that I would like to add, I agree with, totally agree with what Alan just said. But to prevent confusion, when he said that model averaging has a much better coverage than the earlier situation where we took the lowest BMDL and the highest BMDU, indeed that has not such a good coverage, but it is in the conservative sense. So the coverage will be too high. So that's important to realize, that you don't think, oh, wait a minute, I'm not protective anymore. It's on the other way around. You are overly protective probably when you use the simpler model of taking the BMDL and the BMDU from all the models.
Can I speak to that?
Yes.
Yeah.
As long as you're picking the lowest BMDL. So if you're using the EPA's guidance approach, which is to pick a single model, you're not in that case. If you're picking the lowest BMDL, then you are correct that you're probably being conservative. That's under that approach. So you have that. And I would like to address the bomb in the room. Given that I'm a Bayesian non-parametrician, technically, I really like non-parametric models, and if you put reasonable constraints on the models, you can get very good coverage and very good properties, better than your parametric models. The problem often is that they're not interpretable like
your standard models. So it adds a layer of confusion to the output, because where at least you have parameters that you can name the parameters in a maximum likelihood type approach. For instance, a colleague of Alan Leonid was on a paper that used a Gaussian process, which is a non-parametric approach. Well, a Gaussian process technically has an infinite number of parameters. So how does one describe an infinite number of parameters in a model? So it becomes more difficult that way. But if you're only interested in the benchmark dose or the benchmark dose lower bound, it might be an incremental improvement in that regard. So.
Yeah, true. And then another disadvantage of parametric is that it is, at least I don't see it, how you could do a covariate approach, in that, because the parameters are not really interpretable, and that's what you would like to do in a covariate approach.
Well, there are generalized additive models and other things to do. You can do that. It's just...
Yeah, you can do that technically, but I mean, it is interesting for the biologist to say, okay, in this case my backgrounds are different, in this case my potency is different, and maybe in other cases the shape parameters are different, and that is important information, and to distinguish that.
Well, that's the point. It's like how much you're squeezing out of the model versus it becomes a difference between prediction and inference. If you want better prediction, non-parametric is the way to go. If you're inferring things about the thing, about your population, a parametric model is the way to go, because it tells you, just don't think that that parametric model represents the true state of affairs. That's kind of one of the problems with inference on a parametric model, because oftentimes I'll see in the literature someone talk about a parametric model and they describe it as if that represents somehow the true state of nature, and they really believe in their model. It's a good substitute and a good surrogate for often what goes on, and it gives you a good idea of the processes, but again, it's just a simplification. The true state of nature is a very difficult process, best represented by non-parametric. So it's one, if you really want to model just to predict, then the non-parametric is the way to go. If you're more interested in the parameters like you're talking about and the other things, then a parametric model provides inference that you can't do otherwise with a non-parametric model. In some cases, I'll put an asterisk there, because there are things you can do, but they get more and more complicated, and we don't have enough time to talk about.
To me, this sounds more like fine-tuning the modeling of the data you have on the table. And nobody knows what the real situation actually is. The true dose response remains unknown. So, to me, using parametric models in the way we are discussing this now for almost a full day, using the current BMDS software packages, is addressing this question: how can I fit a model to the dose response data? And if you now fine-tune these models ever more, does this really help? Because if you would rerun the same experiment, you would get slightly different data points, where another model may fit better. And trying to fine-tune models sounds like, yeah, again, trying to find the best model for that particular data set, but that's not really helpful. Or am I mistaken here?
Well, I think that there's definitely a pragmatic reality that through all of these, we're talking about model averaging. My method of model averaging and the previous method of model averaging that I proposed, when you're modeling a data set, in reality, if you have one with a BMDL of, say, 10, the other one might provide a BMDL of, say, 9.5. So that's, from a practical, pragmatic standpoint, not going to be very different. From a scientific standpoint, you know, we're statisticians. That's what we do. We want to make better models. So it's kind of a risk management decision of what you do. But I think we are reaching a point where we're most comfortable with, especially the dichotomous range. I can't necessarily say I agree with everything with the continuous statements made, but at least in the dichotomous range, we're at a point where we're pretty comfortable with what we're doing and the results that we're giving.
But even in that case, I mean, I think that there are still statistical techniques out there that you can just control for overfitting, because what you are just basically describing is overfitting. You are trying to follow so well your data that you are going to be able to do that, but then it's not generalizable to if you would take a different data set. But there are techniques out there that is basically controlling for overfitting. You could use that in a no-parametric way as well. I don't think that is really a problem. You know, the issue is that maybe we don't need to. I mean, okay, we are going to gain something, but are we really gaining so much that this is really necessary? That's the thing that we need to take a balance out. But there are things that we could do without any problem to try to get rid of the issues that you were thinking that could be raised.
Remarks, question from the floor? Out again?
I think the last remark from Matt makes, puts things into perspective. So we are now discussing mathematical methods to improve them, but when you look at the difference they make on the final answers, they are quite marginal. And I would like to remind you on my first slide there, where I had a pretty good data set, nothing wrong with that, where different risk assessors identified an NOAEL with a 12-fold range, which is really something else.
Can I then ask another question from a risk assessor's point of view? Having used BMDS and PROAST for quite some time, remembering back at the 64th JECFA, I thought we were using PROAST version 20-something. Now I see version 62 or 61. So maybe that's an unfair question, but for a risk assessor that raises some question. What has happened between version 21 and 61? So what would have happened if I rerun PROAST 61 with the same data at the 64th JECFA or any other data set? I think that is a question which may come up. It's similar, but not as sounds less dramatic with BMDS. I started off with BMDS, I think, version 2, and now it's, what is it? 2.6. There it goes by decimal points. But again, I take it, that sounds less an increment, but again, there are 6 versions in between with a lot of discussions among statisticians, I'm sure, but as a user, as an end user, that raises this kind of question, and I tried out, and yes, it changes some decimal points in the BMD sometimes, but it gives to me a sort of an uncertainty. If some of you could address this a little bit.
Yeah, well, with BMDS on our website, we try to be as explicit as possible with changes that have been made to the GUI, and a lot of the changes that have been made are superficial. It's not superficial as meaningless, but it doesn't pertain to how the individual models run. So oftentimes it's more informative to look at what the version number is of the actual model executable, because those don't often change. So just to, the logistic model, that's been the same executable in version 2.6, 2.5, 2.4, 2.1. So that model should be giving you the same result over time. We have the version history page on on our website that lets you know what is changing in between the versions. And oftentimes it doesn't necessarily have to do with how the individual models are running or the results they give. And as an end user, it's really important when you document your modeling results that you include information like that. What version of the software you use, because if something does change and we noticed an error in how standard errors are calculated, if you just say I used BMDS and don't tell a user, don't report out that you use 2.6, and somebody goes back and they haven't updated it and they're using 2.4, and then they get different results, that's where the confusion comes in. So I would say always err on the side of providing too many details of how you did your modeling, because that will help people that are consumers of your risk assessments.
I know that in the case of pros it's a little bit different. On the other hand, I have an iPhone and I get an update every 2 weeks or so, 3 weeks maybe. Joseph, don't you? Pardon? You don't get an iPhone update of the iOS system every 3 weeks, and you then think, yes. Oh, can I trust this? So, well, basically the reason that I have so many numbers is that I want to keep track of any change that is being made in the software. So when someone sends me an email and says, well, I want to do this, and I think I have a bug, or maybe he asks or she asks for a small extension, I can do that quite rapidly, make a new package and send it back, and the user is very happy that he can now do what he wants to do. And I then give that a new number, because then I can keep track of every single package that has been used. And as Ellen just said, if you want to see if your results are reproducible, it is of course very important to know what version you used in first instance, and why and when you get another result, which I hope doesn't happen very often, and I think it doesn't happen very often actually. Then at least when it does happen, then you at least can see, okay, that was because I used that other version, and apparently there was an error in that earlier version. So that's really the reason. But so you don't really need to worry about all those version numbers.
That's referring to my follow-up question, that also on the EFSA web tool, if you register, you may get emails saying bug number 5 solved. And that's also a bit alerting for a non-specialist, because that tells me there was an error, just like you said, and I have heard Clark, whenever talking to a modeler, I'm told, don't worry, I fixed that bug. And that's sometimes a little bit irritating to a non-expert in that area. And I know I'm playing a little bit devil's advocate. I have talked to Jose about, and it's all the time there is an explanation, but if you just get an email, bug number X is fixed, I read that as there was something wrong before.
Yeah, but most of the bugs relate to user interface issues or plotting issues. So something doesn't work, or there goes something wrong, which is very, very evident. You just see it as a user, and it's very rarely it happens that the numbers that you want to know are really wrong. It rarely happens.
I think this is really an important take-home message, because if you start use it and you get messages like this, that shouldn't stop you using it. It's really sometimes, and in the early, just to give you an example, in the early days, even when I started using the web tool, sometimes when doing the bootstraps, if it depends on the data set, that it took a hell of a time to find the right starting points, and it went on almost for hours. And that was then fixed, and that's one of these bugs that it helps you to use it in a more user-friendly way. And yeah, that's an example of this.
I mean, the idea is basically to keep track of every single issue that has been reported, and also the ones that has reported, just to give an information, the issue that you have reported has been fixed, you know, now it's not there anymore. It is the word that now, I think that in general, if you look in the R community, the people that are using R as is very common. You know, you basically have a versioning that, because it's very dynamic system. You know, it's just everybody that is providing a package is basically the maintainer of that package. Thus, the people are able to do things very rapidly. They are able to cope with whatever questions that you have. Thus, these things is different from, you know, Windows 7, Windows 8, and Windows 10. You know, in this case, we are much more dynamic, trying to solve issues that has been reported, and then that's why you have a different versioning, in order to be able just to keep track of things that was happening in the past, just history. But in terms of estimations and things like that, they are okay. It's not any issue related to the estimation problems. It's issues related to mostly just options that we are giving within the platform, you know, web connections. You know, sometimes also when you are trying to connect, there is some technology that is used in the background. We call it web sockets, and sometimes these things get lost, and then you get these kind of waiting times that are not there, you know, don't communicate, and then you basically get the application running there forever as well. And things that we were learning in the period of, you know, developing the tool. This is also common when you are developing any application. I don't think that we need to worry about the methods, and the methodology that is behind is solid and it has very sound scientific grounds. We don't need to be worried about that. But, you know, it's software development. There are things that are going to be basically just coming, and things that are going to be fixed, bugs that are going to be appearing. But in any software you have patches then that later you need to install because there was something there. These things happen everywhere that you just develop a software. We don't need to worry about it.
Thanks for this, and I really think it's an important message. It's a communication issue, and that makes, for a non-specialist modeler, is very important to have this confidence. Yes, the system is evolving, but it hasn't an influence on my BMD estimation overall.
Yeah, I would, you know, even maybe go a step further and say that the increase in version numbers, whether it's incremental on the decimal scale or, you know, larger, should almost be like a source of comfort that the software is continually getting better. And I would say the vast majority of changes that are made to the version of BMDS include not necessarily bug fixes, but improvements to the user experience and an incremental addition of functionality to the software. So, you know, you shouldn't look at the fact that over, you know, about 5 years we've gone from, you know, version 2.1 to 2.6 and say, oh, they've, you know, there have been a lot of bugs in the software that have had to be fixed. It's, no, we've, you know, improved what the software can do, and 2.6 is a stronger platform because of those efficiency gains, not because, you know, version 2.1 or 2.2 had so many mistakes in it that it needed to be fixed. It should be just like, you know, if you're used to using, you know, Word 2016, go back to Word 97 and try to use it, and you're going to want to throw your computer out the window.
Matt?
Yeah, I would also like to say that, you know, all the software that we use gets updated all the time. And you talked about Windows 10, there's a patch every month that happens. And the other thing is, oftentimes if there is a bug, in my experience of developing it, when I develop the software, I focus mainly on getting the right answer.
and then after that, there's some other extraneous output or something else that's not necessarily as important, and that's where the bug happens. So I think if there's a bug, it's usually something like that that's not instrumental to the actual risk assessment process. It's some other little piece of information. And I know, at least with BMDS, if they do update a package that actually changes the model, they have a test suite where they run the answers and they check at least, are these answers the same answers that we got last time? So that's an added layer, and it's to say that these programs are really tested a lot before they come out anyway. A lot of times it's just user interface things and things that you never thought somebody would do. The only bug I've ever found in the model averaging software in 10 years was a colleague. She modeled data that I told her prior to modeling it, I was like, don't use the software, it's bad. It was basically no dose response. I mean, it was 0 or 100% response. And I'm just like, don't use it. It's dumb to use it. And it, of course, made the thing blow up. But so you have that.
Any remarks, Barbara? Just wait for the microphone.
Okay, I have a completely different technical question. So if you, for instance, have a high mortality rate in a carcinogenicity study, then you would account for this mortality. Is this also done in BMD modeling? And how?
There are a number of ways that you can address that issue with BMD modeling. There's the time to tumor model, and so that takes into account intercurrent mortality. I think Prost has the time. Do you have a time to tumor model?
Well, it can be done, yeah. It's
Yeah.
not called time to tumor model, but it can be done, yeah.
It's the time to tumor model is not in the BMDS suite. It is a DOS program, so maybe a more extreme example from going to Word 2016 to 97. You have to remember how to run things from the command line. There are other ways to deal with it. You can do a poly 3 adjustment, or what's more technically called a poly K adjustment, where you address an animal's time, how long they were in the experiment and whether or not they had time to develop that tumor due to their early mortality. NTP typically uses a poly 3 adjustment because the third degree tracks tumor progression in time well. You can use different exponents for different tumors that are either slower developing or faster developing. So you could do a poly 5 adjustment or a poly 2 adjustment. But it's in the literature. I'm a fan of the poly 3 adjustment because that allows you to also do a multi-tumor analysis. So if you are interested in, you have a cancer bioassay and you have 4 tumors, the practice previously was you model all the tumors independently, you pick the most sensitive one and base your cancer slope factor on that. The NRC and independent researchers have shown that underestimates risk. In BMDS we have what we call the MS combo model, which calculates the probability of developing any combination of tumors in your bioassay. If you individually adjust the tumors based on the poly 3 adjustment and you get your adjusted counts, you can then use those adjusted counts in the MS combo model. If you use the multi-stage Weibull model, which is our time to tumor model, you're modeling each tumor individually, and then you have to use some statistical combination to arrive at that joint probability or that probability of developing any combination of tumors. So it's a little bit more onerous. So I'm more of a fan of the poly 3 adjustment and then using that in the MS combo model.
Okay, Thank you. But so that means that this would be an alert for us users, not to really to look at the data, and if we have a study with high mortality rate, not just use the EFSA BMD tool. Or what happens if we just run it ignoring the mortality rate?
So, you know, if you do the poly3 all the poly3 adjustment does is it scales your number of animals on test. So the number of tumor-bearing animals stays the same, the N changes. So you could do the poly3 adjustment and at that point make a decision, well, I want to use, you know, model averaging approach. Currently, the EPA guidance is set up that we use the multi-stage model preferentially for cancer data. So it's not an issue for cancer data for EPA guidance because we're not concerned about model averaging. There's a policy decision that's been made that says use the multi-stage model. So the way the MS combo model works is you model each tumor individually, you select the degree of the multi-stage model that fits that data the best, and then the model will provide the combined risk estimate. So you're avoiding the model averaging approach using the MS combo model, but you can absolutely use your scaled data that come out of the poly3 adjustment with the model averaging web tool.
I wanted to also comment one thing. I'm working right now with TNO in the Netherlands to develop a model average time to tumor approach. So it's basically taking the approach of the BMDS, and we are looking at different failure time models and different dose response models and using that in terms of a time to event type model to use model averaging. So it's kind of the next step.
Further questions, remarks? Yes, there's one over there.
I would like to ask if in some of the existing tools already exist or is foreseen to be introduced some consideration of outliers for a cleaning of the data before proceeding to modeling.
When we talk about outliers, you can think about two things. Outliers as in terms of an individual replicate or animal being an outlier, which is the more usual way of, what most people would have in mind when they think of outliers. And one way to address individual outliers, sorry, I'm allergic for feathers, so, is to consider the distribution of the data, and the way to do that is to calculate what we call residuals, which is the distance of each individual point to the fitted dose response curve. Because when you do that, then you can combine all the residuals and they should have the same distribution based on the assumption that the variances are the same.
Yeah, but the existing tools, they don't do it. We have to do it separately in another software and then to pass the clean data in the tools from the benchmark dose.
Yeah, but this is included in the Pro software. So you, well, actually not in the web application yet, but we are going to include that. So you can just click on the button and say, give me the QQ plot of the residuals. And this also gives you a message based on the statistical criterion whether there may be an outlier, if there may be an outlier in your data, or maybe more than one. So then you can just say, okay, let's remove the outlier and see what is the impact on my result. Another thing is that there may be outliers on the level of dose groups. So it might be that one dose group differs from the other dose groups by some unknown experimental factor, which those disturbing factors that may occur in real life experiments. And that is more difficult, of course, to address. And if you have only 3 dose groups, you will probably not see that any one of those dose groups might be an outlier. But when you have 6 or 7 or 8 dose groups, then you will probably, well, at least you have more, a better chance to detect one of the dose groups being an outlier.
Yeah, I think that for us it's more important maybe to consider a cleaning in the control group, because in any case in the dose groups it's a little bit difficult to be sure that something is outlier and not a more sensitive animal or whatever, but in some cases we see real outliers in the control, and we can see it also from the historical control values. And obviously if this is not pre-cleaned, then can really take out the whole evaluation. But my point is that if this ability is already included in one of the tools, can save us a lot of time, you know, instead of going to another software, make the analysis thing, take out, and then move all data again to the... That's why I think practically, if it's not already there, it will be something to consider for version 63 or whatever, or number 2 for EFSA. Thank you.
I would also like to comment that there are methods that are in the literature that I've developed that aren't necessarily software packages that we're going to move on, that are more robust regression techniques. So the outliers don't matter, essentially. That's the key, that a lot of these techniques, one outlier might really influence the result, but I think in some of these methods we might want to talk about using methods that are more robust in terms of it doesn't matter if you have an outlier, you're going to get the same result, because it takes into account such a thing. So that's another option for us to consider in future things.
Okay, but again, I think that in most cases one outlier will hardly have an effect on the BMDL. So it might change a little bit, but in my experience it doesn't really have a dramatic effect on the BMDL or the BMDU. So that is something, well, you might consider first before we are going to think about other techniques, which is of course a major effort.
But I mean, from a statistical point of view, if you just forget about BMD and things like that, when you deal with an outlier in general, if you are not dealing with a robust method to deal with outlier, you basically provide the two analyses anyway, considering the outlier in, taking the outlier out, look at what is happening in your model, and then try to see if that is plausible or not plausible. And there is a lot of things that need to come from the toxicology and the biology, you know, in order to be able just to refuse one of the analyses and then say, okay, I don't want to have that, but you need to give also arguments about these kind of things. Or moving to the more robust type of techniques in which outliers matter less. I wouldn't say don't matter, but matter less. But it's okay. This is something that we could just work in the future.
One question over there.
Okay, thank you. My question is somehow related to the previous two questions. In practice, we quite often encounter the situation that we see an effect, but there's no clear dose response. And taking the traditional NOAEL approach, such effects confined, let's say, to the low or mid-dose levels are quite often disregarded if we don't have a more or less obvious explanation for that. And I would like to know how is the performance of the BMD approach in general, and in particular if the performance of the different models is different with regard to that problem.
I'm not exactly sure what data you have in mind here, but if you are talking about a statistical significantly different dose group, but not in a dose-related fashion, I think that's what you're talking about, then I would say, well, okay, let's try to do the BMD approach, and what will happen is that the null model will not be rejected. So we would simply say we stop here according to the flowchart. And the interpretation of this one dose group that differs significantly from the controls is exactly that this is an outlier on the dose group level. So something happened in this experiment which we don't really know, but there's some unknown disturbing factor which caused this outlier. And that happens all the time, and people forget about it because you just look at the dose response data and you don't see, well, you only see the doses. But dose groups not only differ in dose, they also differ in other things that occur that are happening during your experiment. For instance, they are not housed in exactly the same cage. We are talking about animals in different cages. They are not exactly the cages are not exactly located on the same place. Maybe the measurements are not done at exactly the same point in time. The feeding is not done on exactly the same point in time. So there are all different circumstances. And then the other thing is that I have a lot of experience with what experimenters do in their studies, and they very often do not realize that that certain factors, they systematically differ between those groups, might have an impact. So when I ask them, do you have any potential confounding factors in this study, they nearly always say no. Simply, they just say no. And then I ask them, but what about this? Because I looked at your study design, don't you think this could be a potential confounding factor? And then they start to hesitate and say, okay, yeah, well, maybe. So this is a very important thing, that real data may have outliers on the dose group level. And the data that you are now discussing is, for me, empirical evidence that this really happens. And you will see it only when you have multiple doses.
And to me, it talks also about the important fact that before going to modeling, it's really judging the data set you have on the table. Look at the study. What is the study quality? Are there possible confounding issues you can already see from the study description? So this is an important, vital part in any assessment, even before going to dose response modeling. Any other points to be raised? Questions? Remarks? From the floor, from the table? If not, I would like to thank all the speakers, and then I hand over to Tobin, and I have a few messages. One message I got from the modelers is a lot is going on from the point of view as just a simple user of these tools. I think there are also some issues about harmonizations with regard to terminology. You might have noticed that sometimes we are talking about dichotomous data, which is exactly the same for me as quantal data. You have noticed a CED, which is exactly the same as the BMD, sorry. You see, that's also sort of confusing. Or be reminded about the parameter C, which sometimes is a slope parameter, and sometimes, I guess, it's the maximum response. You have a model 3 and 5. You are wondering what is model 4 then? Why is it lacking? These are confusing things, which is in a way a communication issue we shouldn't worry about, but it also adds sort of confusion for the non-specialist modeler. Don't be afraid of this. I'm sure that in the long run this will be solved, and it's not the only area where such discrepancies are happening. Just to name one, on this side of the Atlantic, we are talking about a reference point, which is exactly the same as a point of departure on the other side of the Atlantic. So, yes, there are terminology issues which we as end users sometimes get confused about, but the good thing is that what I took from today's discussions, even if you get messages like box number X is fixed, that doesn't worry me, because it's mainly making my life easier in using the software. And that's an important message. And I think this kind of communication issue needs to be addressed at one point. There is a final message to all of you. You will get, by the end of this week, an email with a questionnaire about the satisfaction about this workshop. You have to fill that in. especially if you want a certificate that you have attended, because you can only download the certificate if you complete the questionnaire, and at the end you have a button where you can click on, and then you get a certificate of attendance. That's just a little bit pushing you to fill in the questionnaire, which is important for EFSA, and there might be questions there how to improve things like this, whether you liked it. Well, I think with that, I would like to thank all the speakers, all the participants for the lively discussions, and with that, I would like also to thank EFSA, of course, to have organized this. I really think it's important to talk to each other, to get the understanding where are the real problems from a model's point of view, and should I, as an end user, be worried about this? And that helps in a long run, I think, actually applying the BMD approach and making it more concrete for the end user. With that, I would like to hand over to Toby.
Okay, thank you, Joseph. So I'd like to take you back, in fact, right to the start of the meeting, if you can remember back that far, before we were bombarded with statistics and modelling. Good old days. So really, I said we had 3 aims for this meeting, and the first 2 were the presentation, indeed, of EFSA's updated guidance on benchmark dose response, and also the presentation of our new platform, the new tool for carrying this out. And indeed, we've had both of those aspects presented to you, so those are quite easy aims for us to achieve. The third aim, the more complex one, I would say, is to promote some robust discussion about our updated guidance, about the benchmark dose response in particular, and stimulated by presentations from, in fact, other agencies that are implementing benchmark dose response, with a view to seeing whether we can move towards some harmonisation on how we apply this. And as Joseph said, we had some very good, robust discussions, even a bit of emotion being displayed in the room. I think that's always a very good sign. It shows that what we're discussing is important and it counts. I think also what we saw, and I think very importantly, is that over the last 10 years or so, when we've been trying to implement this approach, what we have today is quite a lot of convergence, indeed, on the overarching principles on how this should be done, and in particular, more and more on the details of how to implement this. I think that we are very close to 100% agreement on the overarching principles, and getting close to 100% on the details of how to implement benchmark dose. I think this is very good result for us, but I think it's also a very important message to the wider scientific community. And again, as we've discussed, it's one of the issues behind getting greater uptake of this approach across the scientific risk assessment community. And I think from this discussion that we had in the workshop, I think that we can quite clearly demonstrate that there are no excuses for not using this approach. We have agreement on the methodology, pretty much agreement on how to apply it. We now have very good tools, very user-friendly tools on how to use this methodology, along with good descriptions of how to use those tools. So I think we are all in agreement here that there are no excuses not to push forward with benchmark dose. What also I'm very reassured by, and I think this too will help with this implementation, is a number of times throughout this meeting it was clearly mentioned that this is a support to a multidisciplinary approach for chemical risk assessment. And it's quite clearly stated that this is just part of the tools that we use, and that toxicological expertise clearly has its place, a fundamental place in carrying out risk assessment, and that there is and needs to be a good exchange and discussion between our statisticians and our modelers and the toxicologists to achieve good reproducible results. I think that too is I think a very reassuring acknowledgement of the role of everybody in the risk assessment process. And two, certainly from EFSA's side, I think what was very reassuring is, again, I would say universal agreement about the need to have transparent risk assessment processes, and so to clearly describe how we're applying benchmark dose when we're using it. I have a confession to make. I'm not a toxicologist and I'm not a modeler. I am a microbiologist, and I'm not the only one in the room. Yeah. But for me, this is not unfamiliar territory. In fact, modelling of curves, shall we say, is pretty much fundamental work for a microbiologist. And the models that I see being used, gamma, Hill, exponential, these are extremely familiar to me. And so this, in fact, raises in my mind a question, maybe we've missed a trick here, because there's an awful lot of expertise on curve fitting, if I could simplify it like that, in the microbiological world. Maybe we should be exchanging between these two communities of modelers, but on the chemical side and the microbiological side. I am absolutely convinced there will be learning that will be done. I wouldn't like to say who would learn the most, but I'm sure there will be some learning to be done. Maybe this is something that we can arrange in the future, some exchange here. I think it will be very profitable, because I think the issues being addressed are pretty much the same. I really do. As we said, this meeting has been recorded in full Technicolor, in all its glory. It will be placed on EFSA's channel on YouTube, so it'll be there for all posterity, so you won't be able to escape from what you said. But again, I would support our chair in saying the comments and the discussions were very good, very honest, very fruitful. We will use some of that material, edit it down, and include in some of our training materials that we hope to produce in the future. If your face appears in those, of course, we'll be contacting you to make sure that you would agree with that. Not only that, but the presentations that you saw today, as well as the manual on how to use our tool, these will be placed onto our website, so you'll be able to access those, along with a brief summary of the principal outcomes from the discussions that we had. So this will all be put on our website in the coming days. With this, I would like to bring the meeting to a close. In particular, I would echo Joseph's thanks to you as participants for the excellent discussions that we had. As I say, what we wanted was honesty. We really wanted to see whether there was any particular gaps, holes in our guidance document. I don't think I heard any. That's what I'm hoping. Maybe I'm listening with biased ears to the discussion. But I think very good to have the discussion about coming to an agreement on how to do a benchmark dose response. I'd also like to thank our participants via the web streaming. As I say, we had more than 400 people following this meeting. I think this is, again, a clear indication of the importance of this work and the interest in the scientific community. So this too will be a method that I'm sure we'll be using more and more in other events organised by EFSA. With that, I would like to, of course, thank the technical support that we had for this meeting, right from its inception. So thanks to Vanessa from EFSA for helping us organise this, through to the technical support that we have in the meeting over these last 2 days. So thank you too for the technical staff that are here. Of course, our speakers, thank you very much. Some of you have had to come quite a way to be here, so thank you for making that effort. It's much appreciated, and I think it contributed greatly to the discussions that we had here today. It was exactly what we wanted. And finally, of course, thanks to our chair, Joseph. I think he did an excellent job in not only keeping us to time, which is quite often quite challenging, but also to promoting some very good discussions here in the room. So thank you, Joseph. With that, I would wish you all a very good trip home. Thank you.